The Sisters. An elderly priest is dying in his home, where he is cared for by his 2 sisters. They are sad to lose him, but not everyone is sure about the old man. Even the young boy, who was his friend, has mixed feelings about his death. There was no hope for him this time. It was the 3rd stroke. Night after night I had passed the house and studied the lighted square of window. And night after night I had found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. If he was dead, I thought, I would see the reflection of candles behind the drawn curtain, because I knew that 2 candles were always set at the head of a dead body. He had often said to me, "I am not long for this world," and I had not believed him. Now I knew his words were true. Every night as I stared up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strange in my ears, but now it was like the name of some evil and sinful being. It filled me with fear, and yet I wanted to be nearer to it and to look at its deadly work. Old Cotter was sitting at the fire, smoking, when I came downstairs to supper. While my aunt was spooning out my stirabout, he said, as if returning to some former remark of his, "No, I wouldn't say he was exactly, but there was something strange about him. I'll tell you my opinion." He began to smoke his pipe, no doubt arranging his opinion in his mind. Annoying old fool. When we knew him first, he used to be rather interesting, but I soon grew tired of him and his endless stories. "I have my own ideas about it," he said. "I think it was one of those peculiar cases." He began to smoke again, without telling us his ideas. My uncle saw me staring and said to me, "Well, so your old friend is gone, you'll be sorry to hear." "Who?" said I. "Father Flynn." "Is he dead?" "Mr. Cotter has just told us. He was passing by the house." I knew that I was under observation, so I continued eating as if the news had not interested me. My uncle explained to old Cotter. "The boy and Father Flynn were great friends. The old fellow taught him a great deal, mind you, and they say he had a great fondness for him." "God have mercy on his soul," said my aunt, crossing herself. Old Cotter looked at me for a while. I felt that his little round black eyes were examining me, but I would not satisfy him by looking up from my plate. He returned to his pipe and finally spat rudely into the fireplace. "I wouldn't like children of mine," he said, "to talk too much to a man like that." "How do you mean, Mr. Cotter?" asked my aunt. "What I mean is," said old Cotter, "it's bad for children. My idea is, let a young boy run about and play with boys of his own age. Am I right, Jack?" "That's what I'm always saying to him," said my uncle. "When I was a boy, every morning of my life, I had a cold bath, winter and summer, and that's why I'm the man I am now. Education is all very fine." "Mr. Cotter might have a slice of that cold meat," he added to my aunt. No, not for me," said old Cotter. My aunt brought out the dish of meat and laid it on the table. "But why do you think it's not good for children, Mr. Cotter?" she asked. "It's bad for children," said old Cotter, "because their minds are so impressionable. When children see things like that, you know, it has an effect." I filled my mouth with stirabout, because I was frightened I might express my anger. Stupid, old, red-nosed fool. It was late when I fell asleep. Though I was angry with old Cotter for referring to me as a child, the meaning of his unfinished sentences puzzled me. In the dark of my room, I imagined that I saw again the heavy grey face of the paralysed man. I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to think of Christmas. But the grey face still followed me. It murmured, and I understood that it desired to confess something. I felt my soul moving away into some pleasant and sinful region, and there again I found Father Flynn's grey face waiting for me. It began to confess to me in a murmuring voice, and I wondered why it smiled continually. But then I remembered that it had died of paralysis, and I felt that I, too, was smiling weakly, as if I were the priest, listening to his confession and releasing him from his sin. The next morning after breakfast, I went down to look at the modest little house in Great Britain Street. Today it was closed, and a black bow was tied to the door knocker with a card. I approached and read, July the 1st, 1895. The Reverend James Flynn, formerly of St. Catherine's Church, Meath Street, aged 65 years. Rest in peace. The reading of the card persuaded me that he was dead, and I was disturbed to find myself unsure what to do. If he had not been dead, I would have gone into the little dark room at the back of the house to find him sitting in his armchair by the fire, wrapped up so tightly in his overcoat that he could hardly breathe. Perhaps my aunt would have given me a packet of snuff for him, and this present would have woken him from his bored, sleepy state. It was always I who emptied the packet into his black snuff-box, because his hands shook too much. Even as he raised his large, trembling hand to his nose, little clouds of snuff came through his fingers over the front of his coat. It may have been these constant showers of snuff which gave his ancient priestly clothes their green faded look. The red handkerchief with which he tried to brush away the fallen snuff was no use at all, blackened as it always was with the snuff stains of a week. I wished to go in and look at him, but I had not the courage to knock. I walked away slowly along the sunny side of the street, reading the theatrical advertisements in the shop windows as I went. I found it strange that neither I nor the day seemed in a sorrowful mood, and I felt annoyed at discovering in myself a feeling of freedom. It was as if I had been freed from something by Father Flynn's death. I wondered at this, because, as my uncle had said the night before, he had taught me a great deal. He had studied in the Irish College in Rome, and had taught me to speak Latin properly. He had told me stories about the early Christians and about Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had explained to me the meaning of the different ceremonies of the Mass. Sometimes he had amused himself by putting difficult questions to me, asking me what one should do in certain circumstances. His questions showed me how complicated and mysterious were certain things about the Church which I had always considered simple. The duties of the priest seemed so weighty to me that I wondered how anybody had ever found in himself the courage to carry them out. I was not surprised when he told me that priests had written enormous books in order to provide answers to all these difficult questions. Often, when I thought of this, I could make no answer, or only a very foolish and hesitant one. He used to smile and nod his head 2 or 3 times. Sometimes he had made me learn prayers by heart, and as I repeated them, he used to smile thoughtfully and nod his head, now and then pushing large quantities of snuff up his nose, first on the left side, then the right. When he smiled, he used to uncover his big, discoloured teeth and let his tongue lie on his lower lip, a habit which had made me feel uneasy at the beginning of our friendship, before I knew him well. As I walked along in the sun, I remembered old Cotter's words, and tried to remember what had happened afterwards in the dream. I remembered that I had noticed long curtains and a swinging old-fashioned lamp. I felt that I had been very far away, in some land where the customs were strange. In Persia, I thought, but I could not remember the end of the dream. In the evening, my aunt took me with her to visit the house where Father Flynn lay. It was after sunset, but the windows of the houses that looked to the west reflected the deep gold of a great bank of clouds. Nanny received us in the hall, and my aunt shook hands with her. The old woman pointed upwards with a questioning look, and when my aunt nodded, started climbing slowly up the narrow stairs in front of us. On the first floor, she stopped and signalled us forward encouragingly towards the open door of the bedroom. My aunt went in, and the old woman, seeing that I hesitated to enter, began to signal to me again repeatedly with her hand. I went in on tiptoe. The room, with curtains drawn, was full of dark golden light, in which the candles looked like pale thin flames. He was in a coffin. We all knelt down at the foot of the bed. I pretended to pray, but I could not gather my thoughts because of the sound of Nanny repeating her prayers. I noticed how clumsily her skirt was attached at the back, and how worn her boots were on one side. The idea came to me that the old priest was smiling as he lay there in his coffin. But no, when we got up and went to the head of the bed, I saw that he was not smiling. There he lay, grey-faced and serious, dressed for the Mass, his large hands loosely holding a chalice. There was a heavy smell in the room, the flowers. We crossed ourselves and came away. In the little room downstairs, we found Eliza, seated in Father Flynn's armchair. I felt my way towards my usual chair in the corner, while Nanny brought out a bottle of sherry and some wine glasses. She urged me to take some biscuits, but I refused, because I thought I would make too much noise eating them. She went over quietly to the sofa, where she sat down behind her sister. No one spoke. We all stared at the empty fireplace. My aunt waited until Eliza sighed and then said, "Ah, well, he's gone to a better world." Eliza sighed again and bowed her head in agreement. "Did he peacefully?" asked my aunt after a while. "Oh, quite peacefully," said Eliza. "You couldn't tell when the breath went out of him. He had a beautiful death, God be praised." "And everything?" "Father O'Rourke was with him on Tuesday and said the final prayers with him and everything." "He knew then?" "He was quite ready, quite calm." "He looks quite calm," said my aunt. "That's what the woman we had in to wash him said. She said he just looked as if he was asleep. He looked so peaceful and calm." My aunt drank a little sherry from her glass and said, "Well, anyway, Miss Flynn, it must be a great comfort for you to know that you did all you could for him. You were both very kind to him, I must say." "Ah, poor James," said Eliza. "God knows we did all we could. As poor as we are, we wouldn't see him go without anything while he was living." Nanny had leaned her head against the sofa pillow and seemed about to fall asleep. "There's poor Nanny," said Eliza, looking at her. "She's worn out. All the work we had, she and me, getting in the woman to wash him, and then dressing him, and then the coffin, and then arranging about the funeral mass. If it hadn't been for Father O'Rourke, I don't know what we'd have done at all. It was him who brought us all the flowers, and wrote out the notice for the newspaper, and organised all poor James's papers." "Oh, wasn't that good of him?" said my aunt. Eliza closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. "Ah, there's no friends like the old friends," she said. "When all is said and done, no friends that anybody can trust." "Indeed, that's true," said my aunt. "And I'm sure now that he's gone to his everlasting reward, he won't forget you and all your kindness to him." "Ah, poor James." Eliza stopped and then said thoughtfully, "Mind you, I noticed there was something strange about him lately. Whenever I'd bring his soup in, I'd find him with his prayer book fallen on the floor, lying back in the chair with his mouth open. But still, he kept on saying that before the summer was over, he'd go out for a drive one fine day, just to see the old house where we were all born, and take me and Nanny with him. He had his mind set on that. Poor James. God have mercy on his soul," said my aunt. Eliza wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. "The duties of the priesthood, they were too much for him," she said. "And then his life didn't go quite the way he wanted." "Yes," said my aunt. "He was a disappointed man. You could see that." A silence took possession of the little room. We waited respectfully for Eliza to break the silence, and after a long pause she said slowly, "It was that chalice he broke during Mass. That was the beginning of it. Of course, it wasn't his fault. But poor James was so nervous. God be merciful to him." "And was it that?" said my aunt. "I heard something." Eliza nodded. "It affected his mind. After that, he was always wandering about by himself, talking to no one. So one night he was wanted to visit someone who was dying, and they couldn't find him anywhere. So they looked in the church, and what do you think? There he was, sitting up by himself, in the dark in his confession box, wide awake, and laughing softly to himself." She stopped suddenly, as if to listen. I too listened, but there was no sound in the house, and I knew that the old priest was lying still in his coffin as we had seen him, unsmiling and grey-faced in death, an empty chalice on his chest. Eliza went on, wide awake and laughing to himself. So then, of course, when they saw that made them think that there was something wrong with him. Araby. For a few days the bazaar has come to the city. It is an exciting place for a boy, with its air of Eastern magic and its stalls selling unfamiliar things. It is even more exciting if love is his reason for going there. North Richmond Street was a quiet street, except at the hour when the school on the corner let the boys out. An uninhabited house of 2 floors stood at the end of the street, and the other houses stared at one another with brown, unemotional faces. The person who rented our house before us, a priest, had died in the back living room. Damp air hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was full of old, useless papers. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few thin bushes, under one of which I found part of the priest's rusty bicycle. He had been a very generous priest. When he died, he left all his money to the poor and his furniture to his sister. When the short days of winter came, darkness fell before we had eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses had grown dark. The space of sky above us was the colour of ever-changing violet, and the lamps of the street lifted their weak lights towards it. The cold air bit into us, and we played until our bodies were warm and our faces were pink. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. Our playing brought us through the dark, muddy paths behind the houses, where we risked being attacked by the rough boys who lived there, to the back doors of the dark, wet gardens. When we returned to the street, light shone out from the kitchen windows. If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until he had gone safely into his house. Or if Mangan's sister came out on the doorstep to call her brother into his tea, we stayed in our shadow and watched her look up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we had to leave our shadow and walk up to Mangan's steps. She was waiting for us, her figure sharply outlined by the light from the half-open door. I stood by the railings, looking at her. Her dress swung as she moved her body, and the soft rope of her hair moved from side to side. Every morning, I lay on the floor in our front room, watching her door. The curtain was drawn so that I could just see her, but I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart jumped. I ran to the hall, grabbed my books and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways parted, I quickened my steps and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her, except for a few casual words, and yet her name made my foolish blood race. She was in my mind, even in the most unromantic places. Her name came to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears. I could not tell why. I thought little of the future. I did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not, nor did I know, if I spoke to her, how I could tell her of my confused love for her. But my body was like a harp, and her words and movements were like fingers running over the strings. At last she spoke to me. When she said the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me if I was going to Araby. I forget whether I answered yes or no. It would be a wonderful bazaar, she said. She would love to go. And why can't you? I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet round and round her wrist. She could not go, she said, because she had to stay in her convent. She held on to the railings, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curve of her neck, lit up the hair that rested there, and falling, lit up the hand on the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood there. It's all right for you, she said. If I go, I said, I will bring you something." What foolishness destroyed my waking and sleeping thoughts after that evening. I wished to bring to an end the boring days that remained until Saturday. At night in my bedroom, and by day in the classroom, her face came between me and the page I was trying to read. I heard the word Araby calling to me through the silence which my soul desired. It surrounded me with Eastern magic. I asked for permission to go to the bazaar on Saturday night. My aunt was surprised. On Saturday morning, I reminded my uncle that I wished to go to the bazaar in the evening. He answered me sharply, "Yes, boy, I know." As he was in the hall, I could not go into the front room and look out of the window for her. I left the house in a bad mood and walked slowly towards the school. The air was pitilessly cold, and already I feared what might happen. When I came home to dinner, my uncle had not yet got back home. I sat staring at the clock for some time. When its noise began to annoy me, I went upstairs. From the front window, I saw the other boys playing below in the street. Their cries reached me faintly, and leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I stood there for an hour, seeing nothing but the brown figure in my imagination, with the lamplight on the curve of her neck, her hand on the railings, and the petticoat below her dress. When I came downstairs again, I found Mrs. Mercer, a neighbour, having tea with my aunt. I had to put up with the gossip of the tea table for more than an hour, and still my uncle did not come. When Mrs. Mercer had gone, I began to walk up and down angrily. My aunt said, "I am afraid you may have to put off your bazaar for tonight." At 9 o'clock, I heard my uncle's key in the hall door. I heard him talking to himself, and heard the coat stand rocking when it received the weight of his coat. When he was halfway through his dinner, I asked him to give me the money to go to the bazaar. He had forgotten. "The people are in bed now," he said. My aunt said to him, "Can't you give him the money and let him go? You've kept him late enough as it is." My uncle said he was very sorry he had forgotten. He said he believed in the old saying, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." He asked me where I was going, and when I had told him a second time, he asked if I knew the song about Araby. When I left the kitchen, he was about to tell my aunt the first lines of the song. He gave me 2 shillings, which I held tightly in my hand as I left the house. I walked down Buckingham Street to the station and took the deserted train. After an unbearable delay, it moved slowly out of the station and crept along. When I finally got out, I saw by the station clock that it was 10 minutes to 10. In front of me was a large building which displayed the magical name Araby. I went in quickly, giving a shilling to a tired-looking man, and found myself in a big hall. Most of the stalls were closed, and I recognised a silence like that which fills a church after a service. I walked shyly into the centre of the bazaar. Only a few people were gathered around the stalls that were still open. Remembering with difficulty why I had come, I went over to one of them and examined vases and flowered teapots. At the door of the stall, a young lady was talking and laughing with 2 young gentlemen. I listened to them. "Oh, I never said such a thing." "Oh, but you did." "Oh, but I didn't." "Didn't she say that?" "She did. I heard her." "Oh, there's a naughty little lie." Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me if I wished to buy anything. Her voice was not encouraging. She seemed to have spoken to me out of a sense of duty. I looked nervously at the great vases that stood like Eastern guards at either side of the dark entrance to her stall, and murmured, "No, thank you." The young lady changed the position of one of the vases and went back to the two young men. They continued their conversation as before. Once or twice, the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder. I knew my stay was useless, but I went on looking at her stall to make my interest in what she was selling seem more real. Then I turned slowly away and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the coins to fall against each other in my pocket. I heard a voice call from the upper part of the hall that the light was out. It was now completely dark up there. Staring up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and laughed at by vanity, and my eyes burned with pain and anger. Evelyn. Evelyn is facing the most important decision of her life. Should she stay at home, a place of misery but familiarity, or should she take a risk and seize the opportunity to escape? The decision she makes will determine her whole future. She sat at the window, watching the evening darken the street. Her head was against the curtains, and she could smell the dust in their heavy cotton. She was tired. Few people passed. The man from the last house passed on his way home. She heard his footsteps on the pavement and afterwards on the path in front of the new red houses. One time, there used to be a field in which she and her brothers and sisters used to play every evening with other people's children. Then a man from Belfast bought the field and built houses in it, not like their little brown houses, but bright brick houses with shining roofs. The children from the street used to play together in that field. The Devines, the Waters, the Dunns, she and her brothers and sisters. She thought her family had seemed happy then. Her father was not so bad then, and besides, her mother was alive. That was a long time ago. She and her brothers and sisters were all grown up now, and her mother was dead. Her friend Tizzie Dunn was dead too, and the Waters family had gone back to England. Everything changes. Now she was going to go away like the others, to leave her home. Home. She looked round the room at all its familiar objects, which she had dusted once a week for so many years, wondering where all the dust could possibly come from. Perhaps she would never see again all those things which she had never dreamed of being separated from. She had agreed to go away, to leave her home. Was that wise? She tried to weigh each side of the question. In her home, she had shelter and food. She had people she had known all her life around her. Of course, she had to work hard both in the house and at business. What would they say of her in the shop where she worked, when they found out that she had run away with a fellow? They would say she was a fool, perhaps, and they would advertise to fill her place. Miss Gavin, the manager, would be glad. She had always had a sharp tongue, especially whenever there were people listening. "Miss Hill, don't you see that these ladies are waiting? Hurry up, Miss Hill, please." Evelyn would not cry many tears at leaving the shop. But in her new home, in a distant, unknown country, it would not be like that. Then she would be married. She, Evelyn. People would treat her with respect then. She would not be treated as her mother had been. Even now, although she was over 19, she sometimes felt herself in danger of her father's violence. She knew it was his violence that had weakened her heart. When they were growing up, he had never hit her, like he used to hit her brothers Harry and Ernest, because she was a girl. But recently, he had begun to threaten her and say what he would do to her. And now she had nobody to protect her. Ernest was dead, and Harry was nearly always working away from home. Anyway, she was tired of arguing about money every Saturday night. She always gave all her wages, and Harry always sent what he could. But the difficulty was to get any money from her father. He said she was no good with money, and that he wasn't going to give her his hard-earned money to throw about the streets. He said much more too, because he was usually bad from drinking on Saturday nights. In the end, he used to give her the money and ask her if she had any intention of buying Sunday's dinner. Then she had to rush out as quickly as she could and do her shopping, holding her black leather purse tightly in her hand as she elbowed her way through the crowds, and returning home late, loaded with shopping. She had hard work to keep the house together after her mother's death, and to see that the 2 young children who had been left in her care went to school regularly and got their meals on time. It was hard work, a hard life. But now that she was about to leave it, she began to feel it was not so bad after all. She was about to explore another life with Frank. Frank was very kind, manly, open-hearted. She was going away with him by the night boat to be his wife, and to live with him in Buenos Aires, where he had a home waiting for her. How well she remembered the first time she had seen him. He was staying at a house on the main road where she used to visit. It seemed only a few weeks ago. He was standing at the gate, his sailor's cap pushed back on his head, and his hair falling forward over his brown face. Then they had come to know each other. He used to meet her outside the shop every evening after work and take her home. He took her to the cinema, and she felt delighted to be sitting there next to him. He was awfully fond of music and sang a little. When he sang about the girl who loves a sailor, she always felt pleasantly confused. First of all, it had been exciting to have a fellow, and then she had begun to like him. He told stories of distant countries he had been to, and the ships he had sailed on. He had been lucky in Buenos Aires, he said, and had come back to the old country just for a holiday. Of course, her father had found out about Frank and had forbidden her to talk to him. "I know these sailor fellows," he said. One day, he had quarrelled with Frank, and after that, she had to meet her lover secretly. The evening deepened in the street. The 2 white letters in her hand were in shadow. One was to Harry, the other to her father. Ernest had been her favourite brother, but she liked Harry too. Her father was becoming old lately, she noticed. He would miss her. Sometimes he could be very nice. Not long before, when she was ill for a day or 2, he had read a ghost story to her and made supper for her at the fire. And in the past, when her mother was alive, they had gone to the countryside for the day. She remembered her father once putting on her mother's hat to make the children laugh. Her time was running out, but she continued to sit by the window with her head against the curtain, breathing in the smell of the dusty cotton. Down in the street, far away, she could hear a street organ playing. She knew the piece. How strange to hear it again that very night. It reminded her of her promise to her mother, her promise to keep the home together as long as she could. She remembered the last night of her mother's illness. She was there in the dark, airless room by her mother's bedside, and out in the street, someone was playing a sad Italian song. Her father had rushed out and told the organ player to go away, As she sat there by the window, the full horror of her mother's pitiful life, a life of continual sacrifice, ending in final craziness, made her feel cold to the bone. She trembled as she heard again her mother's dying, senseless words. She stood up with a sudden feeling of terror. Escape! She must escape! Frank would save her. He would give her life. Perhaps love, too. She wanted to live. Why should she be unhappy? She could be happy like other people. Frank would take her in his arms. He would save her. She stood among the moving crowd in the station at the harbour. He held her hand, and she knew that he was speaking to her, saying something about the passage over and over again. The station was full of soldiers with brown bags. She could see the black shape of the ship waiting in the harbour. She answered nothing. She felt her face pale and cold, and out of her desperation, she prayed to God to direct her, to show her what her duty was. The ship blew a long, sad whistle into the mist. If she went, tomorrow she would be on the sea with Frank, sailing towards Buenos Aires. Their passage had been booked. Could she refuse to go, after all he had done for her? Her unhappiness made her feel sick, and she kept moving her lips in silent prayer. A bell rang loudly in her heart. She felt him take her hand. "Come," he said. All the seas of the world washed around her heart. He was pulling her into them. He would drown her. With both hands, she held the iron railing as tightly as she could. "Come," he repeated. No, 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 it was impossible. She held on to the railing, confused and desperate, sending out a cry of pain among the seas. "Evelyn! Evie!" He rushed beyond the railings and called to her to follow. People shouted at him to go on, but he still called to her. She turned her white face to him, unmoving, like a helpless animal. Her eyes gave him no sign of love. They did not even seem to recognize him or say goodbye. 2 Gallants. 2 young men, Corley and Lenihan, are short of money. But Corley has a way with women. Corley's latest girl is a servant in a big house, and the young men have plans for her. Can Corley persuade her to take something from the house, and can Lenihan trust him? The grey, warm evening of August had descended on the city, and a warm air, a memory of summer, moved through the streets. With their shops closed for Sunday, the streets were filled with brightly coloured crowds. The lamps shone down on the living pattern below, which, changing shape and colour endlessly, sent up into the warm grey evening air an unchanging, continual murmur. 2 young men came down the hill of Rutland Square. One of them was just bringing a long speech to a close. The other, who walked on the edge of the pavement and was at times obliged to step onto the road because of his companion's rudeness, wore an amused, listening face. A sailing cap was pushed far back on his head, and the story that he was listening to made constant waves of expression break out over his face, from the corners of his nose and eyes and mouth. Little bursts of chesty laughter followed one another out of his bent-over body. His eyes, shining with cunning enjoyment, glanced at every moment towards his companion's face. His trousers, his white rubber shoes, and the light jacket casually thrown over one shoulder all expressed youth. But there was a roll of fat around his waist. His hair was thin and grey, and his face had a ruined look. When he was quite sure the story had ended, he laughed noiselessly for fully half a minute. Then he said, "Well, that's the best I've ever heard. That really takes the biscuit." He became serious and silent when he had said this. His tongue was tired because he had been talking all the afternoon in a bar in Dorset Street. Most people thought Lenihan was always looking for a free drink, but in spite of this reputation, his cleverness and good conversation usually ensured him a place among his friends. He had a brave manner of coming up to a party of them in a bar and of holding himself ready on the edge of the group until he was included in the next order of drinks. He was insensitive to every kind of rudeness. "And where did you pick her up, Corley?" he asked. Corley ran his tongue quickly along his upper lip. "One night, man," he said, "I was going along Dame Street, and I noticed a fine girl under Waterhouse's clock. I said, 'Good evening,' you know. So we went for a walk, and she told me she was a servant in a house in Baggot Street. I put my arm round her and kissed her a bit that night. Then next Sunday, man, I met her by appointment. We went to Donnybrook, and I took her into a field there. It was fine, man. She'd bring me cigarettes every night and pay for the tram out and back. And one night, she brought me 2 damn fine cigars." "Maybe she thinks you'll marry her," said Lenihan. "I told her I was out of a job," said Corley. "She doesn't know my name. I was too clever for that. But she thinks my family has money, you know." Lenihan laughed again noiselessly. "Of all the good ones I ever heard," he said, "that really does take the biscuit." Corley's walk showed that he appreciated this remark. The swing of his muscular body forced his friend to jump lightly onto the road and back again to the pavement. Corley was the son of a police inspector, and he had inherited his father's powerful build and way of walking. He held his back very straight as he walked, moving his head from side to side. His head was large and oily, with a big round hat placed sideways on it. He always stared straight ahead, as if he were a marching soldier. He spoke without listening to the speech of his companions, and his conversation was mainly about himself. Lenihan offered his friend a cigarette. As the 2 men walked on through the crowd, Corley occasionally turned to smile at the passing girls. But Lenihan's eyes were fixed on the 2 rings around the large faint moon. He watched the passing of the grey shadows across its face. Finally, he said, "Well, tell me, Corley, I suppose you'll be able to pull it off all right, eh?" Corley closed one eye expressively as an answer. "Will she do it?" asked Lenihan doubtfully. "You never can tell with women." "She's all right," said Corley. "I know how to persuade her, man. She's a bit fond of me." "You've really got away with women," said Lenihan admiringly. Corley did not notice the amusement in his friend's voice. "There's nothing better than a good servant girl," said Corley. "Take my word for it." "From one who has tried them all," said Lenihan. "First, I used to take girls out, you know," said Corley, "on the tram somewhere, or take them to a band or the theatre, or buy them chocolates and sweets or something. I used to spend money on them right enough." Lenihan nodded seriously. "I know that game," he said, "and it's a fool's game." "And I never got any damn thing out of it," said Corley. "Same for me," said Lenihan. "Only, there was one of them." He ran his tongue along his upper lip again. The memory brightened his eyes. He, too, stared at the pale moon and seemed to be thinking deeply. She was a bit of all right, he said regretfully. After a pause, he added, She's with some other fellow now. You broke her heart, I suppose, said Lenihan knowingly. Honest to God, said Corley. She left me herself. Lenihan shook his head and smiled, disbelieving. You know you can't fool me, Corley. What woman has a chance with you? As they passed by the railings of Trinity College, Lenihan looked up at the clock. 20 past, he said. Time enough, said Corley. She'll be there all right. I always let her wait a bit. Lenihan laughed quietly. Damn it, Corley. You know how to treat them, he said. I know all their little tricks, Corley confessed. But tell me, said Lenihan again, are you sure you can pull it off? Women are damn difficult about this sort of thing. His bright, small eyes searched his companion's face. Corley swung his head from side to side, as if to throw off an insistent insect, and he frowned. I'll pull it off, he said. Leave it to me, can't you? Lenihan said no more. He did not wish to anger his friend. But Corley soon stopped frowning. His thoughts were running another way. She's a damn fine girl, that's what she is, he said appreciatively. They turned into Kildare Street. A harpist stood in the road, playing to a little ring of listeners. He touched the strings carelessly, glancing from time to time at the face of each newcomer and tiredly at the sky. The notes of the piece sounded deep and full in the evening air. The two men walked up the street without speaking, followed by the sorrowful music. At Stephen's Green, the noise of trams, the lights, and the crowd released them from their silence. There she is, said Corley. At the corner of Hume Street, a young woman was standing. She wore a blue skirt with a jacket and a white sailor hat. Let's have a look at her, Corley, said Lenihan. An unpleasant smile appeared on Corley's face. What are you trying to do? He asked sharply. Damn it, said Lenihan. I don't want an introduction. All I want is to have a look at her. I'm not going to eat her. Oh, a look at her, said Corley in a friendlier way. Well, I'll go over and talk to her, and you can pass by. Right, said Lenihan. Corley had already started walking towards her when Lenihan called out, And after, where will we meet? Corner of Merrion Street, 10:30, answered Corley. Make sure you pull it off now, said Lenihan. Corley did not answer. He walked casually across the road, approached the young woman, and without taking his hat off, began at once to talk to her. Once or twice she laughed and, with a knowing smile, bent her head towards him. Lenihan observed them for a few minutes. Then he crossed the road. As he approached Hume Street corner, he found the air heavily perfumed, and his eyes made a rapid, anxious examination of the young woman's appearance. Her blue skirt was held at the waist by a belt of black leather, and a big bunch of red flowers was pinned to her chest. Lenihan noted approvingly her short, strong, muscular body. Good health shone in her fat red face and in her confident blue eyes. She had a wide nose, an unpleasant smile, and two big front teeth. As he passed, Lenihan took off his cap, and Corley returned the greeting. Lenihan followed them, stepping lightly in his white shoes, as they walked down one side of Merrion Square. When he had watched them climb the stairs of the Donnybrook tram, he turned and went back the way he had come. Now he was alone, His face looked older. His cheerfulness seemed to abandon him, and he let his hand run along the railings beside the pavement. The music which the harpist had played began to control his movements, his feet playing the tune and his fingers tapping out variations. He felt tired and bored. If he went to a bar, he knew he would have to talk a lot and amuse everyone, and his brain and throat were too dry for that. The problem of how he could pass the hours till he met Corley troubled him. He went on walking, and paused, at last, in front of a poor-looking cafe. After glancing cautiously up and down the street, he went in quickly. He was hungry, because he had not eaten since breakfast. He sat down at an uncovered wooden table and asked the dirty serving girl to bring him a plate of hot cooked vegetables and a bottle of lemonade. He spoke to her roughly, to cover up the gentlemanly impression he gave, because when he had come into the cafe, everyone had stopped talking. His face was heated. To appear natural, he pushed his cap back on his head and planted his elbows on the table. When his food came, he ate it greedily and found it so good that he made a mental note of the cafe. When he had finished his meal, he sat for some time thinking of Corley's adventure. In his imagination, he saw the pair of lovers walking along some dark road. He heard Corley's deep voice, gallantly and enthusiastically flirting with the young woman, and saw again her knowing smile. This vision made him powerfully aware of his own lack of money and spirit. He was tired of moving from place to place, of having to plot and lie and be cunning. He would be 31 in November. Would he never get a good job? Would he never have a home of his own? How pleasant it would be to have a warm fire to sit by and a good dinner to sit down to. Experience had made his heart bitter against the world, but all hope had not left him. He might still be able to live happily in some comfortable corner, if he could only find some good, simple-minded girl with a little cash of her own. He paid the dirty serving girl and went out of the shop to begin his wandering again. When he saw by the clock of the College of Surgeons that it was exactly 10 o'clock, he hurried back to the corner of Merrion Street. There he leaned against a lamppost and waited. He wondered if Corley had asked her yet, or if he would leave it until the last moment. He suffered all the anxiety and excitement of his friend's situation as well as his own. But the memory of Corley's confident walk calmed him. He was sure Corley would pull it off all right. All at once, the idea came to him that perhaps Corley had deceived him and taken her home by another way. Would Corley do a thing like that? He lit his last cigarette and began to smoke it nervously, watching as each tram stopped at the far corner of the square. They must have gone home by another way. The paper of his cigarette broke, and he threw it into the road with a curse. Suddenly, he saw them coming towards him. He almost jumped with delight and tried to read the result in their walk. They were walking quickly. They did not seem to be speaking. He felt a sharp disappointment. He knew Corley would fail. They turned down Baggot Street and he followed them. They talked for a few moments, and then the young woman went down the steps into the basement of a house, while Corley remained standing on the pavement. Some minutes passed. Then the front door was opened slowly and cautiously. A woman came running down the front steps and coughed. Corley went towards her. His large figure hid hers for a few seconds, and then she reappeared running up the steps. The door closed, and Corley began to walk away. Lenihan hurried in the same direction. Some drops of light rain fell. He took them as a warning, and glancing back towards the house to see that he was not observed, ran eagerly across the road. "Hello, Corley," he called out breathlessly. Corley turned to see who had called him, and then continued walking. Lenihan ran after him. "Hello, Corley," he cried again. He came level with his friend and looked keenly into his face. He could see nothing there. "Well," he said, "did you pull it off?" Still without answering, Corley went up a side street. His face was completely calm. Lenihan kept up with his friend, breathing uneasily. He was puzzled, and a threatening note came into his voice. "Can't you tell me?" he said. "Did you ask her?" Corley stopped at the first street lamp and stared tight-lipped in front of him. Then, with a deliberate movement, he put out a hand towards the light and, smiling, opened it slowly for his admiring follower to see. A small gold coin shone there. The boarding house. Mrs. Mooney says nothing at first when a young man begins a close relationship with her daughter. He is a serious young man with a good salary, so she is waiting for the right moment, the moment when he cannot walk away without losing his honour. Mrs. Mooney was a butcher's daughter. She was a woman who was quite able to manage things herself, a determined woman. She had married her father's assistant and opened a butcher's shop near Spring Gardens. But as soon as her father was dead, Mr. Mooney began to go to the devil. He drank, stole money from the shop, and ran wildly into debt. It was no use making him promise not to drink. He was sure to start again a few days after. By fighting his wife in the presence of customers, and by buying bad meat, he ruined his business. One night, he attacked his wife with the meat knife, and she had to sleep at a neighbour's house. After that, they lived apart. She went to the priest and got a separation from him, with care of the children. She refused to give him money or food or a bed in the house, and so he found occasional work as a debt collector. He was an untidy, red-eyed little drunk, while she was a big, impressive woman. She took what remained of her money out of the butcher business and started a boarding house in Hardwicke Street. The people who stayed there paid 15 shillings a week for a room and their meals, not including beer at dinner. Some of them were tourists from Liverpool and the Isle of Man, and some, occasionally, artistes from the music halls, singers and dancers who entertained for a living. The resident population was made up of office workers from the city. Mrs. Mooney governed her house cunningly and firmly, and knew when to be stern and when to let things pass. She was known as the Madam. All the resident young men shared the same tastes and interests, and for this reason they were very friendly with each other. Jack Mooney, the Madam's son, had the reputation of being a hard case. He was fond of swearing like a soldier, and he usually came home in the early hours of the morning. On Sunday nights, there would often be a small party in Mrs. Mooney's front room. The music hall artistes would sing and someone would play the piano. Polly Mooney, the Madam's daughter, would also sing. Polly was a pretty girl of 19. She had light, soft hair and a small, full mouth. Her eyes, which were grey with a shade of green through them, had a habit of glancing upwards when she spoke with anyone. Mrs. Mooney had first sent her daughter out to work as a typist, but as a red-eyed debt collector used to come every other day to the office asking to say a word to his daughter, she had taken Polly home again and told her to do the housework. As Polly was very high-spirited, the intention was to let her flirt with the young men. Besides, young men like to feel that there is a young woman not very far away. But Mrs. Mooney knew that the young men were only passing the time. None of them meant business. Things went on like this for a long time, until one day Mrs. Mooney noticed something going on between Polly and one of the young men. She watched the pair and said nothing. Polly knew that she was being watched, but her mother's continued silence could not be misunderstood. There had been no open understanding between mother and daughter, but although people in the house began to talk of the relationship, still Mrs. Mooney did not interfere. Polly began to grow a little strange in her manner, and the young man was evidently anxious. At last, when she judged it to be the right moment, Mrs. Mooney took action. She dealt with problems of right and wrong as a knife deals with meat, and in this case she had made up her mind. It was a bright Sunday morning of early summer, promising heat, but with a fresh, light wind. All the windows of the boarding house were open, and the delicate curtains were blowing gently towards the street. The bells of St. George's Church were constantly ringing, and churchgoers crossed the little square with prayer books in their gloved hands. Breakfast was over in the boarding house, and Mrs. Mooney watched the servant Mary remove the breakfast plates. She made Mary collect the pieces of broken bread to help make Tuesday's bread pudding. When the table was cleared, the broken bread collected, and the sugar and butter safe under lock and key, she began to reconstruct the interview which she had had the night before with Polly. Things were as she had suspected. She had been open in her questions, and Polly had been open in her answers. Both had felt slightly awkward, of course. Mrs. Mooney had not wished to receive the news too casually, or to seem to have helped the relationship along. Polly always found this kind of conversation embarrassing, and also did not want anyone to think that she had guessed the reason behind her mother's silence. Mrs. Mooney glanced at the clock in the breakfast room. It was 17 minutes past 11. She would have lots of time to discuss the matter properly with Mr. Doran, and then get to the short mass at the Marlborough Street Church at 12 o'clock. She was sure she would win. To begin with, she had all the weight of social opinion on her side. She had allowed him to live beneath her roof, assuming that he was a man of honour, and he had deliberately deceived her, using her hospitality for his own wicked purposes. He was 34 or 35 years old, so youth could not be used as his excuse. Nor could ignorance be his excuse, since he was a man who had seen something of the world. He had simply taken advantage of Polly in her youth and inexperience. That was evident. The question was, what reparation would he make? There must be reparation in such cases. It is all very well for the man. He can go on his way as if nothing had happened, having had his moment of pleasure, but the girl has the worst of it to deal with. Some mothers would be content to take money. She had known cases where that had happened, but she would not do so. For her, only one reparation would be acceptable for the loss of her daughter's honour: marriage. She counted all her cards again before sending Mary up to Mr. Doran's room to say that she wished to speak with him. She felt sure she would win. He was a serious young man, not wild or loud-voiced like the others. She did not think he would like people to know what had happened. All the guests in the house were beginning to gossip about him and Polly. Besides, he had been employed for 13 years in a respectable company's offices, and if they knew about his immorality, it would mean for him, perhaps, the loss of his position. If he agreed, on the other hand, all might be well. She knew he had a good salary, for one thing, and suspected he had some savings. Nearly past. She stood up and looked at herself in the mirror. The firm expression on her large red face satisfied her, and she thought of some mothers she knew who could not get their daughters off their hands. Mr. Doran was very anxious indeed this Sunday morning. He had made 2 attempts to shave, but his hand had been so unsteady that he had been obliged to stop. 3 days' reddish beard covered his chin, and every 2 or 3 minutes a mist gathered on his glasses, so that he had to take them off and wipe them with his handkerchief. The memory of his confession of the night before was a cause of great pain to him. The priest had made him confess every dreadful detail, and in the end had made his sin seem so great that he was almost thankful at being given the opportunity of reparation. The harm was done. What could he do now, except marry her or run away? He could not simply ignore it or pretend it had never happened. His employer would be certain to hear of it. Dublin is such a small city. Everyone knows everyone else's business. All his long years of service gone for nothing. All his hard work thrown away. As a young man, he had been a bit wild, of course. He had boasted of his free thinking and denied the existence of God to his companions in bars. But that was all past and finished with. Nearly. He did his religious duties carefully, and for 9/10 of the year lived a regular life. He had enough money to get married on. It was not that. But his family would not think Polly was good enough. First of all, there was her drunken father, and then her mother's boarding house was beginning to get a bad name. He had an idea that he was being tricked into marriage. He could imagine his friends talking about it and laughing. She was a little coarse, and sometimes she said, "I seen," and "if I had have known." But what would grammar matter if he really loved her? He could not make up his mind whether to like her or hate her for what she had done. Of course, he had done it too. A small voice deep inside him urged him to remain free, not to marry. Once you are married, you are finished, it said. While he was sitting helplessly on the side of the bed in shirt and trousers, she tapped lightly on his door and entered. She told him that she had confessed everything to her mother, and that her mother would speak with him that morning. She cried, and threw her arms round his neck, saying, "Oh, Bob, Bob, what am I to do? What am I to do at all?" She would put an end to herself, she said. He comforted her weakly, telling her that it would be all right, never fear. He felt her soft, warm roundness against his shirt. It was not altogether his fault that it had happened. He remembered well, with the curious, patient memory of a man unused to women, the first casual touches that her dress, her breath, her fingers had given him. Then late one night, as he was undressing for bed, she had tapped at his door, shyly. She wanted to relight her candle from his, as hers had blown out. It was her bath night. She wore a loose jacket, with her warm skin visible beneath it, and as she lit her candle, a faint perfume rose from her hands and wrists. On nights when he came in very late, it was she who warmed up his dinner. He hardly knew what he was eating, feeling her beside him, alone at night in the sleeping house. And her thoughtfulness. If the night was at all cold or wet or windy, there was sure to be a little glass of hot whiskey ready for him. Perhaps they could be happy together. They used to kiss. He remembered her eyes, the touch of her hand, and his madness. But madness passes. He echoed her question, thinking of himself. What am I to do? The small voice urged him to hold back. But the sin was there. Even his sense of honour told him that reparation must be made for such a sin. While he was sitting with her on the side of the bed, Mary came to the door and said that Mrs. Mooney wanted to see him in the front room. He stood up to put on his coat and waistcoat, more helpless than ever. When he was dressed, he went over to comfort her. It would be all right, never fear. He left her crying on the bed and whispering softly, "Oh my God!" Going down the stairs, his glasses became so misted up that he had to take them off and wipe them. All he wanted was to rise through the roof and fly away to another country, where he would never hear again of his trouble. And yet, a force pushed him downstairs step by step. On the last few stairs, he passed Jack Mooney, who was coming up from the kitchen with 2 bottles of beer. They greeted each other coldly, and the lovers' eyes rested for a moment on a thick, aggressive face and a pair of thick, short arms. When he reached the foot of the stairs, he glanced up and saw Jack looking down at him. Suddenly, he remembered the night when one of the music hall artistes had made a rather rude remark about Polly. The party had almost broken up because of Jack's violence. Everyone tried to quieten him. The artiste, a little paler than usual, kept smiling and saying that there was no harm meant. But Jack kept shouting at him that if any fellow tried that sort of game with his sister, he'd damn well put his teeth down his throat. Polly sat for a little time on the side of the bed, crying. Then she dried her eyes and went over to the mirror. She looked at herself sideways on and readjusted a hairpin above her ear. Then she went back to the bed again and sat at the end. She looked at the pillows for a long time, and the sight of them awoke in her mind secret, pleasant memories. She rested the back of her neck against the cool iron bedhead and fell into a daydream. There was no longer any anxiety visible on her face. She waited on patiently, almost cheerfully, without alarm, her memories gradually giving place to hopes and visions of the future. Her hopes and visions were so fascinating that she no longer saw the white pillows which her eyes were fixed on, or remembered that she was waiting for anything. At last, she heard her mother calling. She jumped to her feet and ran to the top of the stairs. "Polly? Polly!" "Yes, Mamma?" "Come down, dear. Mr. Doran wants to speak to you." Then she remembered what she had been waiting for.
A Little Cloud. A young married man listens enviously as his friend boasts of places he has visited, women he has known, and adventures he has had. So much freedom, so much fun for a single man. Then he returns to his tiny house, his dissatisfied wife, and his crying child. 8 years before, he had watched his friend leave Dublin and wished him a safe journey. Gallagher had done well. You could tell that at once by his travelled manner, his well-cut English suit and fearless accent. Few fellows had skills like his, and fewer still could remain unspoiled by such success. Gallagher's heart was in the right place, and he had deserved to win. It was something to have a friend like that. Little Chandler's thoughts, ever since lunchtime, had been of his meeting with Gallagher, of Gallagher's invitation, and of the great city, London, where Gallagher lived. He was called Little Chandler because, though he was only slightly under average height, he gave people the impression of being a little man. His hands were white and small, his build was delicate, his voice was quiet, and his manners were polite. He took the greatest care of his fair silken hair and moustache, and used a little perfume on his handkerchief. When he smiled, you could see a row of childlike white teeth. As he sat at his desk in the King's Inns, Little Chandler thought what changes those 8 years had brought. His friend, who had been poor and unsuccessful, had become a famous journalist on a London newspaper. He turned repeatedly from his never-ending office work to stare out of the window. It was late autumn, and the sun was going down. The grass and paths of the gardens were bathed in a dull yellow light. The sun showered kindly golden dust on the people who slept on the benches. It shone palely on the moving figures who passed through the gardens. He watched it all and thought of life. And, as always happened when he thought of life, he became sad. A gentle melancholy took hold of him. He felt how useless it was to struggle against ill fortune. This was the wisdom he had learned through long years of experience. He remembered the books of poems on his shelves at home. He had bought them when he was single, and many an evening, as he sat in the little room off the hall, he had been tempted to take one down from the bookshelf and read out something to his wife. But shyness had always held him back, and so the books remained on their shelves. At times he repeated lines of poetry to himself, and this made him feel better. When his day was done, he stood up and left his desk, being careful to say goodbye to every one of his colleagues. A neat, modest figure, he walked rapidly down Henrietta Street. The golden sunlight was fading and the air had grown sharp. A crowd of dirty children populated the street. They stood or ran or crawled up the steps in front of the open doors or sat like little animals in the doorways. Little Chandler gave them no thought. He picked his way lightly through all that rat-like life. No memory of the past touched him, because his mind was full of a present joy. He had never been in Corliss's, but he knew the value of the name. He knew that people went there after the theatre to eat seafood and drink brandy or wine, and he had heard that the waiters there spoke French and German. Walking rapidly past at night, he had seen carriages stop in front of the door, and richly dressed ladies accompanied by gentlemen step out and enter quickly. He had always passed without turning his head to look. It was his habit to walk rapidly in the street even by day, and whenever he found himself in the city late at night, he hurried on his way nervously and excitedly. Sometimes, however, he went to look for the causes of his fear. He chose the darkest and narrowest streets, and, as he walked bravely forward, the silence that spread about his footsteps troubled him, the wandering silent figures troubled him, and at times a sound of low, secret laughter made him tremble like a leaf. He turned to the right towards Capel Street. Ignatius Gallagher on a London newspaper! Who would have thought it possible 8 years before? Still, now that he looked back at the past, little Chandler could remember many signs of future greatness in his friend. People used to say that Gallagher was wild. Of course, he did mix with a wild group of fellows at that time, drank freely and borrowed money on all sides. In the end, he had got mixed up in some shady business, some money deal. That was why he had left Dublin, some people said. But there was always a certain something in Ignatius Gallagher that impressed you in spite of yourself. Even when he was completely out of money, he kept up a brave face. Little Chandler quickened his step. For the first time in his life, his soul protested against the dull plainness of Capel Street. There was no doubt about it. If you wanted to succeed, you had to go away. You could do nothing in Dublin. As he crossed Grattan Bridge, he looked down the river and pitied the poor, low-roofed houses. They seemed to him like a group of homeless travellers crowding together along the river banks, their old coats covered with dirt and dust, made sleepy and stupid by the warmth of the fading sun, and waiting for the first cool air of the night to tell them to rise, shake themselves, and move on. He wondered whether he could write a poem to express that idea. Perhaps Gallagher might be able to get it into some London paper for him. Could he write something original? The thought that a poetic moment had touched him gave him a seed of a hope. He stepped forward bravely. Every step brought him nearer to London, farther from his own dull, inartistic life. A light began to tremble on the horizon of his mind. He was not so old. 32. There were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in poetry. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. Melancholy was a key part of his character, but it was a melancholy softened by reappearances of faith and acceptance and simple joy. If he could give expression to it in a book of poems, perhaps men would listen. He would never be popular, he saw that. He could not persuade the crowd, but he could appeal to a little circle of people of similar minds. He began to imagine what the newspapers would say about his book. Mr. Chandler has the gift of easy and delicate writing. A melancholy sadness floods these poems. It was a pity his name was not more Irish-looking. Perhaps it would be better to use his mother's name as well. Thomas Malone Chandler. Or better still, T. Malone Chandler. He would speak to Gallagher about it. He was so lost in his daydream that he passed his street and had to turn back. As he came near Corliss's, his former anxiety began to overpower him, and he stopped in indecision. Finally, he opened the door and entered. The light and noise of the bar held him at the doorway for a few moments. He glanced quickly to right and left, frowning slightly to make his purpose appear serious, but soon saw that nobody had turned to look at him. And there, sure enough, was Ignatius Gallagher, leaning with his back against the bar and his feet planted far apart. "Hello, Tommy, old hero, here you are. What will you have?" "I'm taking whiskey. Better stuff than we get across the water." "Anything with it?" "No, I'm the same. Spoils the flavour. Here, garçon, as the French say, bring us 2 glasses of your best whiskey." "Well, and how have you been since I saw you last? Dear God, how old we're getting! Do you see any signs of ageing in me? A little grey and thin on the top, eh?" Gallagher took off his hat and displayed a large head with very short hair. His face was heavy, pale, and clean-shaven. His blue-grey eyes shone out plainly above the bright orange tie he wore. He bent his head and felt with 2 sympathetic fingers the thin hair on the top. Little Chandler shook his head as a denial. Gallagher put on his hat again. "It pulls you down," he said. "A journalist's life. Always hurry and worry, looking for stories and sometimes not finding them. Damn papers and printers, I say, for a few days. I'm glad I can tell you to get back to the old country. It does a fellow good, a bit of a holiday. I feel a lot better since I landed again in dear, dirty Dublin. Here you are, Tommy. Water? Say when." Little Chandler allowed his whiskey to be very much watered down. "You don't know what's good for you, my boy," said Gallagher. "I drink mine neat, not a drop of water." "I drink very little as a rule," said Little Chandler modestly. "An occasional half when I meet any of the old crowd, that's all. "Ah, well," said Gallagher cheerfully. "Here's to us and to old times and old friendship." They touched glasses, raised them, and drank. "I met some of the old gang today," said Gallagher. "O'Hara seems to be in a bad way. What's he doing?"
"Nothing," said Little Chandler. "He's gone to the devil."
"But Hogan has a good job, hasn't he?"
"Yes, he's working for the government."
"I met him one night in London and he seemed to have plenty of money. Poor O'Hara. Drink, I suppose."
"Other things too," said Little Chandler shortly.
Gallagher laughed. "Tommy," he said, "I see you haven't changed one little bit. You're the very same serious person that used to scold me on Sunday mornings when I had a sore head and fur on my tongue. You should see a bit of the world. Have you never been anywhere, even for a trip?"
"I've been to the Isle of Man," said Little Chandler.
Gallagher laughed. "The Isle of Man," he said. "Go to London or Paris. Paris for choice. That'd do you good."
"Have you seen Paris?"
"I should think I have. I've spent a bit of time there."
"And is it really as beautiful as they say?" asked Little Chandler. He took a little of his drink while Gallagher finished his in one mouthful.
"Beautiful," said Gallagher, pausing on the word and on the flavour of his drink. "It's not so beautiful, you know. Of course, it is beautiful. But it's the life of Paris, that's the thing. Oh, there's no city like Paris for fun, movement, excitement."
Little Chandler finished his whiskey and finally succeeded in catching the barman's eye. He ordered the same again.
"I've been to the Moulin Rouge and seen the girls dance there," Gallagher continued. "Hot stuff. Not for a God-fearing, church-going fella like you, Tommy."
Little Chandler was beginning to feel rather disappointed in Gallagher. There was something coarse about the man's accent and way of expressing himself, which he had not observed before. But after all, Gallagher had lived. He had seen the world. Little Chandler looked at his friend enviously.
"Tell me," he said, "is it true that Paris is as immoral as they say?" "Every place is immoral," said Gallagher, spreading his right arm out wide. "Paris, London. Talking of immorality, I've known cases."
Calmly and in detail, he went on to paint for his friend some pictures of the wickedness which was found everywhere abroad. He described the sins of many capitals and seemed tempted to give first prize to Berlin. He revealed many of the secrets of foreign convents and the practices which were fashionable in high society. Little Chandler was amazed.
"Ah, well," said Ignatius Gallagher, "here we are in dusty old Dublin, where nothing is known of such things."
"How dull you must find it," said Little Chandler, "after all the other places you've seen."
"Well," said Gallagher, "it's a relaxation to come over here, you know. And after all, it's the old country, isn't it? But tell me something about yourself. Hogan told me you had tasted the joys of married life. 2 years ago, wasn't it?"
Little Chandler reddened and nodded.
"I hope it's not too late to offer my best wishes," said Gallagher, shaking Little Chandler's hand. "Any young ones?"
Little Chandler reddened again.
"We have a son." Gallagher clapped his friend loudly on the back. "Well done," he said. "I wouldn't doubt you, Tommy."
Little Chandler smiled and looked confusedly at his glass. "I hope you'll spend an evening with us," he said, "before you go back. My wife will be delighted to meet you. We can have a little music and—"
"I'm awfully sorry, old man," said Gallagher. "But tonight I've arranged to go to a little card party with another fellow, and I must leave tomorrow night. But who knows? Next year I may come over here again, now that I've broken the ice."
"Very well," said Little Chandler. "The next time you come we must have an evening together. That's agreed now, isn't it?" He ordered a final couple of drinks, feeling warm and excited.
The whisky had gone to his head, because he was not used to drinking. The adventure of meeting Gallagher again, of listening to Gallagher's stories, and of sharing, for a short time, Gallagher's glorious wandering life, upset the balance of his sensitive character. He clearly felt the difference between his own life and his friend's, and it seemed unjust. Gallagher was lower than him in birth and education. He was sure he could do something better than his friend had ever done, something higher than cheap journalism, if only he got the chance. What was it that stood in his way? His unfortunate lack of courage. He wished to prove his manhood in some way. He saw behind Gallagher's refusal of his invitation. Gallagher was only being friendly to little Chandler because he considered himself more important, just as he was visiting Ireland in order to display his wealth and success. The barman brought their drinks. Little Chandler lifted his glass bravely. "Who knows?" he said. "When you come next year, I may have the pleasure of wishing long life and happiness to Mr. and Mrs. Ignatius Gallagher." Gallagher closed one eye expressively. When he had drunk, he smacked his lips decisively, set down the glass, and said, "No damn fear of that, my boy. I'm going to see a bit of life and the world before I put my head in the sack, if I ever do." "Some day you will," said little Chandler calmly. Gallagher turned his orange tie and blue-grey eyes full on his friend. "You think so?" he said. "You'll put your head in the sack," repeated little Chandler firmly, "like everyone else, if you can find the girl." There had been slightly too much force in his words, and he was aware that he had betrayed himself. But although the colour had risen in his face, he did not look away from his friend's stare. Gallagher watched him for a few moments and then said, "If ever it happens, there'll be no foolish stuff about love. I intend to marry money. She'll have a good fat account at the bank, or she won't do for me." Little Chandler shook his head. "You don't believe it?" said Gallagher heatedly. "I've only to say the word, and tomorrow I can have the woman and the cash. There are hundreds, what am I saying, thousands of rich foreign women, rotten with money, who'd be only too glad. You wait a while, my boy, see if I don't play my cards right." He finished his drink and laughed loudly. Then he looked thoughtful and said more calmly, "But I'm in no hurry. I don't like the idea of tying myself up to one woman, you know." He imitated with his mouth the act of tasting and made a disgusted face. "Must get a bit stale, I should think," he said. Little Chandler sat in the room off the hall, holding a child in his arms. He had come home late for tea and, moreover, he had forgotten to bring Annie home the parcel of coffee from Bewley's. Of course she was in a bad mood and gave him short answers. She decided to go out herself to the shop on the corner for some tea and sugar, so she put the sleeping child neatly in his arms and said, "Here, don't waken him." A little lamp with a white shade stood on the table, and its light fell over a photograph of Annie. Little Chandler looked at it, pausing at the thin, tight lips. He looked coldly into the eyes of the photograph, and they answered coldly. Certainly the face itself was pretty, but he found something mean in it. Why was it so unfeeling and ladylike? The calmness of the eyes annoyed him. There was no passion in them, no joy. He thought of what Gallagher had said about rich foreign women. Those dark, eastern eyes, he thought, how full they are of passion. Why had he married the eyes in the photograph? He glanced nervously round the room. Annie had chosen the furniture herself, and it too was formal and pretty. A dull hatred of his life awoke within him. Could he not escape from his little house? Was it too late for him to live bravely like Gallagher? Could he go to London? The furniture was still to be paid for. If he could only write a book, that might open the way for him. A book of poems lay on the table. He opened it cautiously with his left hand in order not to wake the child, and began to read the first poem in the book. He paused, feeling the power of the poem around him in the room. How melancholy it was! Could he, too, write like that? Express the melancholy of his soul in poetry? There were so many things he wanted to describe. His sensation of a few hours before on Grattan Bridge, for example. If he could get back again into that mood. The child woke and began to cry. He turned from the page and tried to quieten it, but it would not be quietened. He began to rock it in his arms, but its loud cries grew stronger. He rocked it faster while his eyes began to read the second poem. It was useless. He couldn't read. He couldn't do anything. The crying of the child went right through his head. It was useless. Useless. He was a prisoner for life. His arms trembled with anger, and suddenly, bending to the child's face, he shouted, "Stop!" The child stopped for an instant, shook with fright, and began to scream. He jumped up from his chair and walked hurriedly up and down the room with the child in his arms. The thin walls echoed with its pitiful screams. He looked at the trembling, shaking face of the child and began to be alarmed. He counted 7 screams without a breath between them, and held the child to his chest in fright. If it died! The door burst open, and a young woman ran in, breathless. "What is it? What is it?" she cried. "It's nothing, Annie. It's nothing," he began to cry. She threw her parcels on the floor and grabbed the child from him. "What have you done to him?" she cried, staring angrily into his face. Little Chandler held her eyes for one moment, and his heart closed together as he met the hatred in them. He said brokenly, "He began to cry. I didn't do anything." Ignoring him, she began to walk up and down the room, holding the child tightly in her arms and murmuring, "My little man. There now, love. Mamma's little man." Little Chandler felt his face redden with shame, and he stood back out of the lamplight. He listened while the child's screaming grew less and less, and tears of guilt and regret came to his eyes.
Clay. Everyone likes Maria, who is kind, careful and thoughtful. At Halloween with her family, the children decide to play a blindfold game. Choose a saucer and discover your future. Water for a life abroad, a wedding ring for marriage, clay for death. Maria had been given permission to leave the laundry house as soon as the women's tea was over, and she looked forward to her evening out. The kitchen was clean and tidy. The cook said you could see yourself in the big shining pots and pans. The fire was nice and bright, and on one of the side tables were 4 very big loaves of fruit bread. They had been cut into long, thick, even slices, and were ready to be handed round at tea. Maria had cut them herself. Maria was a very, very small person indeed, but she had a very long nose and a very long chin. She talked a little through her nose, always comfortingly. "Yes, my dear," and "No, my dear." She was always sent for when the women at the laundry quarrelled over their washing, and she always succeeded in making peace. Once, one of the women had said to her, "Maria, you are a true peacemaker." Everyone was so fond of Maria. The women would have their tea at 6 o'clock, and she would be able to get away before 7. From Ballsbridge to the city centre, 20 minutes. From the city centre to Drumcondra, 20 minutes. And 20 minutes to buy the things. She would be there before 8. She took out her purse with the silver fastenings and read again the words, "A present from Belfast." She was very fond of that purse, because Joe had bought it for her 5 years before, when he and Alfie had gone to Belfast on a trip. She counted her coins. She would have 5 shillings after paying her tram fare. What a nice evening they would have, all the children singing. Only she hoped that Joe wouldn't come in drunk. He was so different when he took any drink. Often he had wanted her to go and live with them, but she would have felt in the way, though Joe's wife was ever so nice with her, and she had become used to the life of the laundry. Joe was a good fellow. She had taken care of him and Alfie when they were little, and Joe often used to say, "Mama is Mama, but Maria is my proper mother." After the break-up at home, the boys had got her that position in the Dublin by Lamplight laundry, where half of Dublin had their washing done, and she liked it. She used to have such a bad opinion of Protestants, but now she thought they were very nice people, a little quiet and serious, but still very nice people to live with. When the cook told her everything was ready for the women's tea, Maria began to pull the big bell. In a few minutes, the women began to come in by 2s and 3s, wiping their steaming hands on their petticoats and pulling down their sleeves over their red steaming arms. They sat down to drink their hot tea, already mixed with milk and sugar. Maria made sure that every woman got her 4 slices of fruit bread. There was a great deal of laughing and joking during the meal. Lizzie Fleming said that Maria was sure to get the ring. And though Fleming said that every Hallow Eve, Maria had to laugh and say she didn't want any ring, or husband either. When she laughed, her grey-green eyes shone with disappointed shyness, and the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin. Then Ginger Mooney lifted up her cup and proposed Maria's health, while all the other women banged with their cups on the table. And Mooney said she was sorry she hadn't any beer to drink to Maria's health with. And Maria laughed again till the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin, until her tiny body nearly shook itself apart, because she knew Mooney meant well, though, of course, she had the manners of a working-class woman. But wasn't Maria glad when the women had finished their tea and the cook had begun to clear away the tea things? She went into her little bedroom and, remembering that there was Mass the next morning, changed the hand of the alarm clock from 7 to 6. Then she took off her working clothes and changed into her best skirt and her best boots. As she stood in front of the mirror, she thought of how she used to dress for Mass on Sunday morning when she was a young girl, and she looked with fondness at her tiny body. In spite of its years, she found it a nice, tidy little body. When she got outside, the streets were shining with rain, and she was glad of her old brown raincoat. The tram was full, and she had to sit on the little seat at the end, facing all the people, with her toes hardly touching the floor. She arranged in her mind all she was going to do, and thought how much better it was to be independent and to have your own money in your pocket, She hoped they would have a nice evening. She was sure they would, but she could not help thinking what a pity it was that Alfie and Joe were not speaking. They were always arguing now, but when they were boys together, they used to be the best of friends. But such was life. She got out of her tram at the city centre and pushed her way through the crowds. Downes's cake shop was so full that it was a long time before she could get served. She bought 12 mixed cakes and at last came out of the shop carrying a big bag. Then she wondered what else to buy. She wanted something really nice. They would be sure to have plenty of apples and nuts. It was hard to know what to buy, and all she could think of was cake. So she went over to a shop in Henry Street. Here she spent so long trying to decide that the young lady assistant, who was evidently a little annoyed by her, asked her if it was wedding cake she wanted to buy. That made Maria redden and smile at the young lady. And finally, she bought a thick slice of fruit cake, which cost 2 shillings and 4pence. She thought she would have to stand in the Drumcondra tram, because none of the young men seemed to notice her. But an elderly gentleman with a square red face and a greyish moustache made room for her. How much more polite he was, thought Maria, than the young men who simply stared straight in front of them. The gentleman began to talk with her about Hallow Eve and the rainy weather. He supposed the bag was full of good things for the little ones, and said it was only right that the children should enjoy themselves while they were young. Maria agreed politely with him. He was very nice to her, and when she was getting out of the tram, she thanked him and bowed, and he bowed to her and raised his hat and smiled pleasantly. While she was going up the street, bending her tiny head under the rain, she thought how easy it was to talk to a gentleman, even when he has had a bit to drink. Everybody said, "Oh, here's Maria," when she came to Joe's house. All the children were in their Sunday clothes. There were 2 big girls in from next door, and games were going on. Maria gave the bag of cakes to the eldest boy to divide, and Mrs. Donnelly said it was too good of her to bring such a big bag of cakes, and made all the children say, "Thanks, Maria." But Maria said she had brought something special for Papa and Mama, something they would be sure to like, and she began to look for her fruit cake. She looked everywhere, but nowhere could she find it. Then she asked all the children if any of them had eaten it, by mistake, of course. But the children all said no, and looked as if they did not like to eat cakes if they were to be accused of stealing. Everybody had an explanation for the mystery, and Mrs. Donnelly said it was plain that Maria had left it behind her in the tram. Maria, remembering how confused the gentleman with the greyish moustache had made her, coloured with shame and annoyance and disappointment. She nearly burst out crying at the thought of the failure of her little surprise, and of the 2 and 4pence she had thrown away for nothing. But Joe said it didn't matter, and made her sit down by the fire. He was very nice with her. He told her all that went on in his office, repeating for her a clever remark he had made to the manager. Mrs. Donnelly played the piano for the children, and they danced and sang. Then the 2 next-door girls handed round the nuts. Nobody could find the nutcracker, and Joe was nearly getting cross over it, saying how did they expect Maria to crack nuts without a nutcracker? But Maria said she didn't like nuts, and they weren't to bother about her. Then they offered her a bottle of beer, and Maria said she would rather not take anything, but Joe insisted. So Maria let him have his way, and they sat by the fire talking over old times. And Maria thought she would put in a good word for Alfie. But Joe cried that God might strike him stone dead if he ever spoke a word to his brother again. And Maria said she was sorry she had mentioned the matter. Mrs. Donnelly told her husband it was a great shame for him to speak that way of his own family. But Joe said that Alfie was no brother of his, and there was nearly a quarrel about it. But Joe said he would not lose his temper as it was Hallow Eve, and asked his wife to open some more beer. The two next-door girls had arranged some Hallow Eve games, and soon everything was cheerful again. The two girls put some saucers on the table and then led the children up to the table to choose, with a blindfold tied round their eyes. 3 children chose the saucer with the water, which meant they would go abroad. When one of the next-door girls got the ring, Mrs. Donnelly shook her finger at the laughing girl as if to say, "Oh, I know all about it." They insisted on putting the blindfold round Maria's eyes and leading her up to the table to see what she would get. And while they were putting on the blindfold, Maria laughed and laughed again, till the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin. Among all the laughing and joking, she put out her hand, as she was told to do. It descended on one of the saucers, and her fingers felt something soft and wet. There was a pause for a few seconds, and then a great deal of whispering. Somebody mentioned clay from the garden, and at last Mrs. Donnelly told one of the next-door girls very crossly to throw it out at once. Maria understood that the game had gone wrong, and so she had to do it again. This time, she got the prayer book. After that, there was more music, and Joe made Maria take a glass of wine. Soon they were all quite happy again, and Mrs. Donnelly said Maria would enter a convent before the year was out, because she had got the prayer book. Maria had never seen Joe so nice to her as he was that night, so full of pleasant talk and memories. She said they were all very good to her. At last the children grew tired and sleepy, and Joe asked Maria if she would sing some little song before she went, one of the old songs. Mrs. Donnelly said, "Do, please, Maria," and told the children to be quiet and listen. So Maria had to get up and stand beside the piano, while Mrs. Donnelly started playing. Very embarrassed, Maria began to sing Michael Balfe's "I Dreamt That I Dwelt" in a tiny, trembling voice. She sang the first part of the song twice, but no one tried to show her her mistake. And when she had ended it, Joe was very much moved. He said that there was no time like long ago, and no music for him like poor old Balfe's, whatever other people might say. His eyes filled up so much with tears that he could not find what he was looking for, and in the end, he had to ask his wife to tell him where the bottle opener was.
A painful case. 2 lonely people find each other and are happy for a time. Then, as love deepens, it becomes too much for one of them and the relationship is broken off. But was that the right decision? And what are the consequences? Mr. James Duffy lived in Chapelizod because he wished to live as far as possible from the city of which he was a citizen, and because he found all the other suburbs of Dublin mean, modern, and full of their own importance. He lived in a dark old house, and from his windows he could look into the disused distillery where whisky was once made, or upwards along the shallow river on which Dublin is built.
The high walls of his uncarpeted room were free from pictures. He had himself bought every piece of furniture in the room: a black iron bed, an iron washstand, 4 chairs, and a square table on which lay a double desk. A bookcase had been made with shelves of white wood. The bed was covered with white sheets, and at its foot there was a black and red blanket. A little mirror hung above the washstand. The books on the white wooden shelves were arranged from below upwards according to their size. Writing materials were always on the desk. On lifting the lid of the desk, a faint smell escaped, the smell of new pencils or of an apple which might have been left there and forgotten. Mr. Duffy hated anything which showed physical or mental disorder. His face, which carried the complete story of his years, was of the brown colour of Dublin streets. On his long and rather large head grew dry black hair, and a golden-brown moustache did not quite cover an unfriendly mouth. But there was no hardness in the eyes which, looking at the world from under their golden-brown eyebrows, gave the impression of a man who was always ready to appreciate the good in people, but often disappointed. He never gave money to beggars, and walked firmly, carrying a stick. He had worked for many years in a private bank in Baggot Street. Every morning he came in from Chapelizod by tram. At midday he took a light lunch, and at 4 o'clock he was free. He had dinner at an eating-house in George's Street, where he felt safe from the society of Dublin's fashionable youth, and where the menu had a certain plain honesty. His evenings were spent either at the piano in his boarding-house, or wandering about the outer parts of the city. His liking for Mozart's music brought him sometimes to an opera or a concert. These were the only unnecessary expenses of his life. He had neither companions nor friends, neither church nor beliefs. He lived his life without any connection with others, visiting his relations at Christmas and accompanying them to the churchyard when they died. He allowed himself to think that in certain circumstances he would rob his bank, but as these circumstances never happened, his life rolled out evenly, an adventureless story. One evening he found himself sitting beside 2 ladies at a concert. The hall, thinly peopled and silent, gave the impression that the concert would be a failure. The lady who sat next to him looked round at the deserted room once or twice, and then said, "What a pity there is such a poor audience tonight. It's so hard on people to have to sing to empty benches." He took the remark as an invitation to talk. He was surprised that she didn't seem awkward at all. While they talked, he tried to fix her permanently in his memory. When he learned that the young girl beside her was her daughter, he judged her to be a year or so younger than himself. Her face, which must have been handsome, had remained intelligent. Her eyes were very dark blue and steady. When she first looked at him, her eyes had a challenging note about them. But then they appeared to half close in a kind of swoon, revealing for an instant a character of great sensitiveness. They opened again quickly. This half-discovered nature was hidden, and her woolen jacket, fastened tightly around her chest, which was of a certain fullness, struck the challenging note more definitely. He met her again a few weeks afterwards at another concert, and seized the moments when her daughter was talking to someone else to find out more about her. She referred once or twice to her husband, but not in such a way as to make the reference a warning. Her name was Mrs. Sinico. Her husband's great-great-grandfather had been Italian and had come from Leghorn. Her husband was captain of a ship sailing between Dublin and Holland, and they had 1 child. Meeting her a 3rd time by accident, he found courage to make an appointment. She came. This was the first of many meetings. They met always in the evenings and chose the quietest places for their walks together. Mr. Duffy, however, had a distaste for secrecy and forced her to ask him to her house. Captain Sinico encouraged his visits, thinking that Mr. Duffy wanted his daughter's hand in marriage. He had dismissed his wife so sincerely from his list of pleasures that he did not suspect anyone else would take an interest in her. As the husband was often away and the daughter out giving music lessons, Mr. Duffy had many opportunities of enjoying the lady's society. Neither he nor she had had any such adventure before, and neither was conscious of any strangeness in their choice of place. Little by little, his thoughts mixed with hers. He lent her books, provided her with ideas, shared his mental life with her. She listened to all. Sometimes, in return for his ideas, she gave out some fact of her own life. With almost motherly care, she urged him to let his nature open to the full. She became his confessor and heard the secrets of his heart. He told her that for some time he had attended the meetings of a political party, an Irish Socialist Republican Party, where he had felt out of place among a crowd of workmen in a tiny upstairs room lit by an inefficient oil lamp. When the party had divided into 3 groups, each under its own leader and in its own tiny room, he had discontinued his attendance. The workmen's discussions, he said, were too fearful, and they took far too much interest in the question of wages. No social revolution, he told her, would be likely to strike Dublin for some centuries. "Why do you not write out your thoughts?" she asked him. "For what?" he asked her. "To compete with journalists who are incapable of thinking about the same thing for 60 seconds? To let myself be criticised by a stupid middle class?" He went often to her cottage, a small house she owned outside Dublin. Often they spent their evenings alone. Little by little, as their thoughts wrapped round each other, they spoke of more private things. Her companionship was like warm earth around a plant. Many times she allowed the dark to fall on them by not lighting the lamp. The quiet, dark room, their isolation, the music that still echoed in their ears brought them together. This closeness raised him to a higher level, wore away the rough edges of his character, emotionalized his mental life. Sometimes he caught himself listening to the sound of his own voice. He thought that in her eyes he would become almost a spiritual being. And as he attached the warm nature of his companion more and more closely to him, he heard the strange, impersonal voice, which he recognized as his own, insisting on the soul's incurable loneliness. "We cannot give ourselves," it said. "We are our own." The end of these conversations was that one night, during which she had shown every sign of unusual excitement, Mrs. Sinico caught up his hand passionately and pressed it to her face. Mr. Duffy was very much surprised. He was disappointed by the way she had taken his words. He did not visit her for a week. Then he wrote to her asking her to meet him. As he did not wish their last interview to be troubled by the memory of their ruined confessions, they met in a little cake shop near the park gate. It was cold autumn weather, but in spite of the cold, they wandered up and down the roads of the park for nearly 3 hours. They agreed to break off their relationship. "Every tie," he said, "is a tie to sorrow." When they came out of the park, they walked in silence towards the tram. But here she began to tremble so violently that, fearing she would break down, he said goodbye quickly and left her. A few days later, he received a parcel containing his books and music. 4 years passed. Mr. Duffy returned to his even way of life. His room still gave witness to the tidiness of his mind, but he seldom wrote on the papers in his desk. One of his sentences, written 2 months after his last interview with Mrs. Sinico, read, "Friendship between man and woman is impossible because there must be sex." He kept away from concerts to avoid meeting her. His father died, the younger partner at the bank retired. And still every morning he went into the city by tram, and every evening walked home from the city after having had a quiet dinner in George's Street and read the evening paper afterwards. One evening, as he was about to put a piece of meat in his mouth, his hand stopped. His eyes fixed themselves on an article in the evening paper which was lying on the table. He replaced the piece of food on his plate and read the article carefully. Then he drank a glass of water, folded the paper and read the article over and over again. The girl came over to ask him if his dinner was not properly cooked. He said it was very good and ate a few mouthfuls of it with difficulty. Then he paid his bill and went out. He walked along quickly through the November half-light, his stick striking the ground regularly. On the lonely road which leads from the park gate to Chapel Izard he slowed down, and his breath, coming out of his mouth irregularly, almost with a sighing sound, turned into mist in the wintry air. When he reached his house, he went up at once to his bedroom and, taking the paper from his pocket, read the article again by the failing light of the window. He read it not aloud, but moving his lips, as a priest does when he reads a prayer silently during Mass. This was the article. Death of a lady at Sydney Parade. A painful case. Today, at the City of Dublin Hospital, an inquest was held on the body of Mrs. Emily Sinico, aged 43 years, who was killed at Sydney Parade Station yesterday evening. The evidence showed that the dead lady was knocked down by the 10 o'clock slow train from Kingstown, while she was attempting to cross the line. Injuries to her head and right side led to her death. James Lennon, driver of the engine, stated that, on hearing the guard's whistle, he started the train, but stopped it a second or two afterwards in response to loud cries. P. Dunn, a railway worker, stated that he observed a woman attempting to cross the line. He ran towards her and shouted, but before he could reach her, she was hit by the engine and fell to the ground. Mr. H. B. Patterson Finlay, on behalf of the railway company, expressed his deep regret at the accident. The dead lady had been in the habit of crossing the lines late at night from platform to platform, and considering certain other circumstances of the case, he did not think the railway officials were to blame. Captain Sinico also gave evidence. He stated that the dead lady was his wife. He was not in Dublin at the time of the accident, as he had arrived only that morning from Rotterdam. They had been married for 22 years and had lived happily until about 2 years ago, when his wife began to behave rather strangely. Miss Mary Sinico said that recently her mother had been in the habit of going out at night to buy alcohol. She had often tried to talk to her mother about this and had persuaded her to get help. She was not at home until an hour after the accident. The court returned a verdict in agreement with the medical evidence and stated that no blame should be attached to anyone. It was a most painful case, and great sympathy with Captain Sinico and his daughter was expressed. Mr. Duffy raised his eyes from the paper and stared out of his window. It was a cheerless evening. The river lay quiet beside the empty distillery, and from time to time a light appeared in some house on the Lucan Road. What an end! The whole story of her death disgusted him, and it disgusted him to think that he had ever spoken to her of his deepest thoughts. The meaningless expressions of sympathy, the cautious words of a reporter trying to hide the details of an unpleasant working-class death attacked his stomach.
Not only had she let herself down, she had let him down too. His soul's companion. He thought of the miserable alcoholics whom he had seen carrying cans and bottles to be filled by the barman. Evidently she had been unfit to live, without any strength of purpose, one of the wrecks on which civilization is built. But to sink so low! Was it possible he had deceived himself so completely about her? He had no difficulty now in approving the decision he had taken. As the light failed and his memory began to wander, he thought her hand touched his. The shock which had first attacked his stomach was now attacking his mind. He put on his overcoat and hat quickly and went out. The cold air met him at the doorway. It crept into the sleeves of his coat. When he came to the bar at Chapelizod Bridge, he went in and ordered a hot whisky. The barman served him politely, but did not attempt a conversation. There were 5 or 6 working men in the bar, discussing the value of a gentleman's land in County Kildare. They drank and smoked, often spitting on the floor and sometimes kicking dust over the spit with their heavy boots. Mr. Duffy sat there, staring at them without seeing or hearing them. After a while they went out and he called for another hot whisky. He sat a long time over it. The bar was very quiet. Now and again a tram was heard on the lonely road outside. As he sat there, living over his life with her, he realized that she was dead, that she had stopped existing, that she had become a memory. He began to feel uncomfortable. He asked himself what else he could have done. He could not have gone on deceiving her husband. He could not have lived with her openly. He had done what seemed to him best. How was he to blame? Now that she was gone, he understood how lonely her life must have been, sitting night after night alone in that room. His life would be lonely too until he too died, stopped existing, became a memory, if anyone remembered him. It was after 9 o'clock when he left the bar. The night was cold and miserable. He entered the park and walked along under the tall, leafless trees where they had walked 4 years before. She seemed to be near him in the darkness. At moments he seemed to feel her voice touch his ear, her hand touch his. He stood still to listen. Why had he withdrawn life from her? Why had he judged her and punished her by death? He felt his moral nature falling to pieces. When he reached the top of the Magazine Hill, he stopped and looked along the river towards Dublin, whose lights burned redly and hospitably in the cold night. He looked down the hill, and at its foot, in the shadow of the wall of the park, he saw some human figures lying on the ground. Their immoral and secretive love filled him with despair. He regretted the correctness of his life. He felt he had missed out on life's riches. One human being had seemed to love him, and he had denied her life and happiness. He had caused her to die a death of shame. He knew that the creatures down by the wall were watching him and wanted him to go. No one wanted him. He was not welcome at life's table. He turned his eyes to the grey, shining river, and beyond the river he saw a train coming out of Kingsbridge Station, like a snake with a head of fire moving through the darkness heavily and deliberately. It passed slowly out of sight,
But still he heard in his ears the heavy sound of the engine repeating her name. He turned back the way he had come, the regular pattern of the engine thundering in his head. He began to doubt the reality of what memory told him. He stopped under a tree and allowed the regular beat of the train to die away. He could not feel her near him in the darkness, nor her voice touch his ear. He waited for some minutes, listening. He could hear nothing. The night was perfectly silent. He listened again. Perfectly silent. He felt that he was alone.
A mother. Motherly love is an extremely powerful emotion. Mrs. Carney will not let anyone take the slightest advantage of her daughter, no matter how much trouble this causes for everyone else, including the daughter she is trying to protect. Miss Devlin had become Mrs. Carney to show people how wrong they were about her. She had been educated in a high-class convent, where she had learned French and music. As she was naturally pale and unbending in manner, she made few friends at school. When she came to the age of marriage, she was sent out to many houses where her playing and perfect manners were much admired. She sat in the icy circle of her skills, waiting for some young man to break bravely in and offer her a life of fame, wealth, and power. But the young men whom she met were ordinary, and she gave them no encouragement, trying to satisfy her romantic desires by eating a great deal of Turkish delight in secret. However, when she approached the limit of marrying age, and her friends began to loosen their tongues about her, she silenced them by marrying Mr. Carney, who was a bootmaker on Ormond Quay. He was much older than she. His conversation, which was serious, took place at intervals in his great brown beard. After the first year of married life, Mrs. Carney realized that, over a lifetime, such a man was more acceptable than a romantic person. But she never put her own romantic ideas away. He drank little, he was careful with money, and he went to church every first Friday in the month, sometimes with her, oftener by himself. She never weakened in her religion, and was a good wife to him. For his part, he was a model father. By saving a small amount of money every week, he ensured that his daughters would receive £100 each when they reached the age of 24. He sent the elder daughter, Kathleen, to a good convent, where she learnt French and music, and afterwards paid for her to attend the Academy of Music. Every year, in the month of July, Mrs. Carney found the opportunity to say to some friend, "My good man is sending us off to the seaside for a few weeks." When the rebirth of interest in the Irish language began, Mrs. Carney determined to take advantage of her daughter's Irish name and brought an Irish teacher to the house. Soon, the name of Miss Kathleen Carney began to be often heard on people's lips. People said that she was very clever at music and a very nice girl, and moreover, that she was a believer in bringing back the Irish language. Mrs. Carney was well content with this. Therefore she was not surprised when one day Mr. Holohan came to her and talked to her about the 4 grand concerts which his Irish Society was going to give at the concert rooms. He proposed that her daughter should accompany the singers on the piano. Mrs. Carney brought him into the sitting room, made him sit down, and brought out the sherry and the biscuits. She entered heart and soul into the details of the project. And finally, a contract was signed, stating that Kathleen would receive 8 guineas for her services as accompanist at the 4 grand concerts. As Mr. Holohan did not know about such delicate matters as wording the advertisements and putting together a programme, Mrs. Carney helped him. She knew how sensitive the artistes were, and how likely they were to be offended if they were not treated correctly. To keep the audience continually entertained, she slipped the doubtful performers in between the old favourites. Mr. Holohan, who had a noticeable limp, called to see her every day to get her advice on something. She was always friendly and helpful. She pushed the sherry towards him, saying encouragingly, "Now, help yourself, Mr. Holohan." Everything went on smoothly. Mrs. Carney bought some lovely pink material to sew into the front of Kathleen's dress. It cost a pretty penny, but there are occasions when a little expense is justifiable. She bought 12 tickets for the final concert and sent them to those friends who could not be trusted to come otherwise. She forgot nothing, and thanks to her, everything that was to be done was done. The concerts were to be on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. When Mrs. Carney arrived with her daughter at the concert rooms on Wednesday night, she did not like the look of things. A few young men stood around near the door, ready to show people to their seats. None of them wore evening clothes. She passed by with her daughter, and a quick glance through the open door of the hall showed her why the young men had nothing to do. At first, she wondered if she had mistaken the hour. No, it was 20 minutes to 8. In the dressing room behind the hall, she was introduced to the society's secretary, Mr. Fitzpatrick. She smiled and shook his hand. He was a little man with a white, vacant face. She noticed that he wore his soft brown hat carelessly on the side of his head, and that he had a flat Dublin accent. He held a programme in his hand, and while he was talking to her, he chewed one end of it into a damp mess. He seemed to bear disappointments lightly. Mr. Holohan limped into the dressing room every few minutes with reports from the ticket office. The artistes talked among themselves nervously, glanced from time to time at the mirror, and rolled and unrolled their music. When it was nearly 8:30, the few people in the hall began to express their desire to be entertained. Mr. Fitzpatrick smiled vacantly at the room and said, "Well now, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose we'd better open the show." Mrs. Carney rewarded his very flat show with a quick stare of disgust, and then said to her daughter encouragingly, "Are you ready, dear?" When she had an opportunity, she called Mr. Holohan to one side and asked him to tell her what it meant. Mr. Holohan did not know what it meant. He said that the committee had made a mistake in arranging the concerts. 4 was too many. Mrs. Carney complained that the artistes were no good. Mr. Holohan admitted the artistes were no good, but the committee, he said, had decided to reserve all the best performers for Saturday night. Mrs. Carney said nothing, but as the poor performances followed each other on the platform, and the few people in the hall grew fewer and fewer, she began to regret that she had put herself to any expense for such a concert. Mr. Fitzpatrick's vacant smile annoyed her very much. However, she said nothing, and waited to see how it would end. The concert died shortly before 10, and everyone went home quickly. The concert on Thursday night was better attended, but Mrs. Carney saw at once that most of the audience had been given free tickets. and they were not behaving as they should for a formal concert. Mr. Fitzpatrick seemed to be enjoying himself, and was quite unconscious that Mrs. Carney was taking angry note of his behaviour. During the evening, Mrs. Carney learned that the Friday concert was to be abandoned, and that the committee was going to move heaven and earth to ensure a full audience on Saturday night. When she heard this, she searched for Mr. Holohan and caught him as he was limping out quickly with a glass of lemonade for a young lady. She asked him if it was true. Yes, it was true. "But, of course that doesn't alter the contract," she said. "The contract was for 4 concerts." Mr. Holohan seemed to be in a hurry. He advised her to speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mrs. Carney was becoming alarmed. She spoke firmly to Mr. Fitzpatrick, saying her daughter should receive the amount originally stated in the contract, whether the society gave the 4 concerts or not. Mr. Fitzpatrick seemed unable to resolve the difficulty, and said he would bring the matter before the committee. Mrs. Carney's anger began to rise in her face, and she had to stop herself asking, "And who is the committee, I would like to know?" But she knew it would not be ladylike to do that, so she was silent. Little boys were sent out into the main streets of Dublin early on Friday morning, with bundles of advertisements. Special articles appeared in all the evening papers, reminding the music-loving public of the wonderful entertainment which it could enjoy on the following evening. Mrs. Carney felt slightly comforted, but she decided to tell her husband about her suspicions. He listened carefully and said perhaps it would be better if he went with her on Saturday night. She agreed. She respected her husband in the same way as she respected the General Post Office, as something large, safe, and fixed. And although she knew his skills were limited, she appreciated his value as a male. She was glad he had suggested coming with her. She thought over her plans. The night of the grand concert came. Mrs. Carney, with her husband and daughter, arrived at the concert rooms 3/4 of an hour before the concert was due to begin. By ill luck, it was a rainy evening. Mrs. Carney left her husband to take care of her daughter's clothes and music, and went all over the building looking for Mr. Holohan or Mr. Fitzpatrick. She could find neither. She asked the young men by the door if any member of the committee was in the hall. After a great deal of trouble, they brought out a little woman named Miss Byrne, who asked if she could do anything. Mrs. Carney looked searchingly at the oldish face, which was wearing a forced expression of trustfulness and enthusiasm, and said, "No, thank you." The little woman hoped they would have a good evening. She looked out at the rain until the melancholy of the wet street wiped all the trustfulness and enthusiasm from her face. Then she gave a little sigh and said, "Ah, well, we did our best." Mrs. Carney had to go back to the dressing room. The artistes were arriving. The bass, Mr. Duggan, was a thin young man with a black moustache. He had even appeared in grand opera. He sang his music loudly and with great feeling, and was always welcomed by the people in the cheap seats. But, unfortunately, he spoiled the good impression he was making by wiping his nose in his gloved hand once or twice, out of thoughtlessness. Mr. Bell, the second tenor, was a fair-haired little man who competed every year in the Irish Music Festival. On his 4th attempt, he had won 3rd prize. He was extremely nervous and extremely jealous of other tenors, and he covered his nervous jealousy with a show of friendliness. When he saw Mr. Duggan, he went over to him and asked, "Are you in it too?" "Yes," said Mr. Duggan. Mr. Bell laughed at his fellow sufferer, held out his hand and said, "Shake!" Mrs. Carney passed by these two men and went to look at the audience. The seats were being filled up rapidly, and a pleasant noise filled the hall. She came back and spoke to her husband privately. Their conversation was evidently about Kathleen, because they both glanced at her often as she stood talking to one of her friends, Miss Healy, the contralto. An unknown woman with a pale face walked through the dressing room. The woman followed with sharp eyes the faded blue dress which was stretched on a thin, bony body. Someone said that she was Madame Glynn, the soprano. "I wonder where they dug her up," said Kathleen to Miss Healy. "I'm sure I never heard of her." Miss Healy had to smile. Mr. Holohan limped into the room at that moment and told them the unknown woman was Madame Glynn from London. The noise of the hall became more noticeable. The first tenor and the baritone arrived together. They were both well-dressed and confident-looking, and they brought a breath of richness among the company. Mrs. Carney brought her daughter over to them and talked to them pleasantly. She wanted to get on well with them, but while she tried to be polite, her eyes followed Mr. Holohan on his limping and secretive way in and out of the room. As soon as she could excuse herself, she went out after him. "Mr. Holohan, I want to speak to you for a moment," she said. They went down to a quiet part of the corridor. Mrs. Carney asked him when her daughter was going to be paid. Mr. Holohan said Mr. Fitzpatrick was in charge of that. Mrs. Carney said she didn't know anything about Mr. Fitzpatrick. Her daughter had signed a contract for 8 guineas, and she would have to be paid. Mr. Holohan said it was not his business, and she had better speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick. When Mrs. Carney came back to the dressing room, her face was slightly red. 2 men had taken possession of the fireplace and were talking familiarly with Miss Healy and the baritone. They were Mr. Hendrick from the Freeman and another journalist, Mr. O'Madden Burke. Mr. Hendrick had come in to say he could not wait for the concert, as he had another event to report on, but that O'Madden Burke would write the review. Mr. O'Madden Burke was an elderly man who balanced his impressive body, when at rest, on a large silk umbrella. He was widely respected. Mrs. Carney began speaking so loudly and angrily to her husband that he had to ask her to lower her voice. The conversation of the others in the dressing room was dying out. From the hall came sounds of encouragement, clapping and stamping. The first tenor and the baritone and Miss Healy stood together, waiting quietly. But Mr. Bell was extremely anxious, because he was afraid the audience would think he had arrived late. Mr. Holohan limped into the room. In a moment he noticed the silence. He went over to Mrs. Carney and spoke very seriously with her. The noise in the hall was growing louder. Mr. Holohan became very red and excited, but Mrs. Carney said shortly, at intervals, "She won't go on. She must get her 8 guineas. Mr. Holohan pointed desperately towards the hall, where the audience was clapping and stamping their feet. He appealed to Mr. Carney and to Kathleen, but Mr. Carney continued to stroke his beard, and Kathleen looked down, moving the point of her new shoe. It was not her fault. Mrs. Carney repeated, "She won't go on without her money." Finally, Mr. Holohan limped out in a great hurry. The room was silent. when the silence had become rather painful, Miss Healy asked the baritone if he had seen Mrs. Pat Campbell at the theatre that week. The baritone had not seen her, but he had been told that her acting was very fine. The conversation went no further. From time to time, everyone glanced at Mrs. Carney. Suddenly, Mr. Fitzpatrick burst into the room, followed by Mr. Holohan, who was breathing hard. Mr. Fitzpatrick held a few banknotes in his hand. He counted out 4 into Mrs. Carney's hand, and said she would get the other half at the interval. Mrs. Carney said, "This is 4 shillings short." But Kathleen gathered in her skirt and said, "Now, Mr. Bell," to the second tenor, who was shaking like a leaf, and they went out together. The noise in the hall died away. There was a pause of a few seconds, and then the piano was heard. The first part of the concert was very successful, except for Madame Glyn's performance. The poor lady sang in such an old-fashioned way that the audience made fun of her. The first tenor and the contralto, though, were enthusiastically received, and Kathleen's selection of Irish pieces was generously clapped. All this time, the dressing room was in a fever of excitement. Mr. O'Madden Burke said Mrs. Carney's behaviour was the worst thing he had ever witnessed. Miss Kathleen Carney had no musical future in Dublin after that, he said. The baritone did not like to say anything, because he had been paid his money and wished to be at peace with all men. But he did think that Mrs. Carney might have taken the artistes into consideration. The secretaries heatedly discussed what should be done when the interval came. In another corner of the room, Mrs. Carney was telling her husband, Mr. Bell, and Miss Healy how badly the committee had treated her. She had spared neither trouble nor expense, and this is how she was repaid. They thought they had only a girl to deal with, but she would show them their mistake. They wouldn't have dared to treat her like that if she had been a man, but she would see that her daughter got her rights. Of course she was sorry for the sake of the artistes, but what else could she do? She appealed to Mr. Bell, who agreed that she had not been well treated. Then she appealed to Miss Healy. Miss Healy wanted to leave Mrs. Carney's group, but did not like to, because she was a great friend of Kathleen's, and the Carneys had often invited her to their house. As soon as the first part was ended, Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Holohan went over to Mrs. Carney and told her that the other 4 guineas would be paid after the committee meeting on the following Tuesday, and that, if her daughter did not play for the second part, the committee would consider the contract broken and would pay nothing. "I haven't seen any committee," said Mrs. Carney angrily. "My daughter has her contract. She will get £4 8 into her hand, or she won't put a foot on that platform." "I'm surprised at you, Mrs. Carney," said Mr. Holohan. "I never thought you would treat us this way." "And what way did you treat me?" asked Mrs. Carney. Her face was flooded with angry colour, and she looked as if she might attack someone with her hands. "I'm asking for my rights," she added, "and whenever I ask when my daughter is going to be paid, I can't get a sensible answer." She threw her head back proudly, and imitating Mr. Holohan's flat accent, said, "You must speak to the secretary. It's not my business. I'm a great fellow. La-di-da-di-da." "I thought you were a lady," said Mr. Holohan, turning and walking quickly away from her. After that, Mrs. Carney's behaviour was criticised on all sides. Everyone approved of what the committee had done. She stood at the door, white and furious, arguing with her husband and daughter. She waited until it was time for the second part to begin, in the hope that the secretaries would approach her. But Miss Healy had kindly agreed to play one or two accompaniments. Mrs. Carney had to stand to one side to allow the baritone and his accompanist to pass up to the platform. She stood still for an instant, like an angry stone figure, and when the first notes of the song struck her ear, she caught up her daughter's coat and said to her husband, "Get a carriage." He went out at once. Mrs. Carney wrapped the coat around her daughter and followed him. As she passed through the doorway, she stopped and stared angrily into Mr. Holohan's face. "I'm not done with you yet," she said. "But I'm done with you," said Mr. Holohan. Kathleen followed her mother obediently. Mr. Holohan began to walk up and down the room in order to cool himself, because he felt his skin on fire. "That's a nice lady," he said. "Oh, she's a nice lady." "You did the proper thing, Holohan," said Mr. O'Madden Burke, balancing on his umbrella in approval.
The Dead. Gabriel cares deeply for his wife, and on a night away from home at a family party, he feels a reawakening of the passion between them that has been buried by their dull existence. But he is shocked to realise that there is a corner of her heart which has been completely hidden from him up to now. Lily, the servant girl, was so busy that she had to run everywhere. Hardly had she brought one gentleman into the little room behind the office on the ground floor and helped him take off his overcoat, when the ancient doorbell rang again, and she had to hurry along the bare hallway to let in another guest. It was lucky for her that she did not have to attend to the ladies as well. But Miss Kate and Miss Julia had thought of that, and had turned the bathroom upstairs into a ladies' dressing room. Miss Kate and Miss Julia were there, gossiping and laughing and fussing, walking after each other to the top of the stairs, looking down and calling to Lily to ask her who had come. It was always a great event, the Mrs. Morcan's annual dance. Everybody who knew them came to it, members of the family, old friends of the family, the members of Julia's choir, any of Kate's pupils who were grown up enough, and even some of Mary Jane's pupils too. Never once had it fallen flat, as long as anyone could remember, ever since Kate and Julia, after the death of their brother Pat, had left the house in Stoneybatter and taken Mary Jane, their only niece, to live with them in the dark old house on Usher's Island. That was a good 30 years ago. Mary Jane, who was then a little girl in short clothes, was now the main support of the household. She was the organist at the church in Haddington Road and gave organ lessons. Old as they were, her aunts also did their share. Julia was still the leading singer in the choir, and Kate gave music lessons to beginners on the old square piano in the back room. Although their life was modest, they believed in eating well, the best of everything. Their servant Lily usually did everything she was told, so she got on well with the three ladies. They were fussy, that was all. Of course, they had good reason to be fussy on such a night. And then it was long after 10 o'clock, and yet there was no sign of Gabriel and his wife. Besides, they were dreadfully afraid that Freddie Malins might arrive drunk. They would not wish for worlds that any of Mary Jane's pupils should see him like that, and it was sometimes very hard to manage him. Freddie Malins always came late, but they wondered what could be keeping Gabriel, and that was what brought them every 2 minutes to the top of the stairs to ask Lily if Gabriel or Freddie had come. "Oh, Mr. Conroy," said Lily to Gabriel when she opened the door for him. "Miss Kate and Miss Julia thought you were never coming. Good evening, Mrs. Conroy." "I expect they did," said Gabriel. But they forget that my wife here takes 3 long hours to dress herself." Lily took his wife to the stairs and called up to Kate and Julia, while Gabriel shook the snow from his galoshes. "Is it snowing again, Mr. Conroy?" asked Lily. She helped him off with his coat. Gabriel glanced at her. She was a growing girl, with a pale face and light-coloured hair. Gabriel had known her since she was a child. "Yes, Lily," he answered, "and I think we're in for a night of it." He glanced at her again. "Tell me, Lily," he added in a friendly way, "do you still go to school?" "Oh, no, sir," she answered. "I'm done with schooling now." "Oh, then," said Gabriel, smiling, "I suppose we'll be going to your wedding one of these fine days with your young man, eh?" The girl said with great bitterness, "The men now are only all talk and what they can get out of you." Gabriel went red, as if he felt he had made a mistake, and without looking at her, kicked off his galoshes and bent down to check the condition of his leather shoes. He was a tallish young man, slightly overweight, with shining black hair and a hairless face. He wore glasses over his delicate and restless eyes. He took a coin rapidly from his pocket. "Oh, Lily," he said, pushing it into her hand, "it's Christmas time, isn't it? Here's a little." "Oh, no, sir," cried the girl. "Really, sir, I couldn't take it." Christmas time," said Gabriel, hurrying to the stairs and waving his hand to her. Seeing that he was already on the stairs, the girl called out after him, "Well, thank you, sir." Upstairs, he could hear that there was dancing in the front room, so he waited outside the door. He was still upset by the girl's bitter and sudden reply. It had made him feel depressed, but he tried to forget it by rearranging the bows of his tie. Then he took from his pocket a little paper and glanced at the notes he had made for his speech. He was undecided about the lines from the Robert Browning poem, because he feared they would be above the heads of his hearers. The clumsy stamping of the men's shoes reminded him that their level of understanding was different from his. They would think that he was showing off his education, which was better than theirs. He would fail with them, just as he had failed with the servant girl downstairs. He had hit the wrong note. His whole speech was a mistake from first to last, a complete failure. Just then, his aunts and his wife came out of the ladies' room. His aunts were 2 small, plainly dressed old women. Aunt Julia was slightly taller. Her hair was grey, and grey also, with darker shadows, was her large face. Her slow eyes and parted lips gave her the appearance of a woman who did not know where she was or where she was going. Aunt Kate had more life in her. Her face, healthier than her sister's, was lined like an old red apple, and her hair had not lost its rich nut-brown colour. They both kissed Gabriel warmly. He was their favourite nephew, the son of their dead sister Ellen. "Greta tells me you're not going to take a carriage back to Monkstown tonight, Gabriel," said Aunt Kate. "No," said Gabriel. "We had quite enough of that last year, with the east wind blowing in through the carriage windows all the way. Don't you remember, Aunt Kate, what a dreadful cold Greta got out of it?" "Quite right, Gabriel, quite right," said Aunt Kate. "You can't be too careful." "But as for Greta there," said Gabriel, "she'd walk home in the snow if she were allowed to." Mrs. Conroy laughed. "Don't listen to him, Aunt Kate," she said. "He fusses so much." "Oh, but you'll never guess what he makes me wear now." She burst out laughing again and glanced at her husband, whose admiring and happy eyes had been wandering from her dress to her face and hair. The 2 aunts laughed heartily too, because Gabriel's anxious care for his wife was a long-standing joke with them. "Galoshes," said Mrs. Conroy. "That's the latest. Whenever it's wet underfoot, I must put on my galoshes. The next thing he'll buy me will be a diving suit." Gabriel laughed nervously, while Aunt Kate enjoyed the joke so much that she nearly bent double with laughter. The smile soon faded from Aunt Julia's face, and looking joylessly at her nephew, she asked, "And what are galoshes, Gabriel?" "Well, Julia," exclaimed her sister, "don't you know what galoshes are? You wear them over your boots, Greta, don't you?" "Yes," said Mrs. Conroy. "Rubber things. Gabriel says everyone wears them on the continent." "Oh, on the continent," murmured Aunt Julia, nodding her head slowly. Gabriel frowned and said, a little crossly, "They're nothing very wonderful, but Greta thinks they're very funny." "But tell me, Gabriel," Aunt Kate put in quickly, "of course you've booked a hotel room." "Oh, the room is all right," replied Gabriel. "I've taken one in the Gresham."
"To be sure," said Aunt Kate. "By far the best thing to do. And the children, Greta, you're not anxious about them?"
"Oh, for one night," said Mrs. Conroy. "Besides, Bessie will look after them."
"To be sure," said Aunt Kate again. "What a comfort it is to have a girl like that, one you can depend on. There's that Lily. I'm sure I don't know what has come over her lately. She's not the girl she was at all."
Gabriel was about to ask his aunt some questions about Lily, but she broke off suddenly to look at her sister, who had moved halfway down the stairs.
"Now, I ask you," she said almost crossly, "where is Julia going? Julia! Julia, where are you going?"
From the stairs, Julia announced without feeling,
"Here's Freddie."
At the same moment, a clapping of hands and a final burst of music told them that the dance had ended. Some couples came out of the front room. Aunt Kate took Gabriel hurriedly to one side and whispered into his ear,
"Go down, Gabriel, like a good fellow, and see if he's all right. Don't let him upstairs if he's drunk. I'm sure he's drunk. I'm sure he is."
Gabriel went to the stairs and listened. He recognised Freddie Mallins's laugh in the hall and went downstairs.
"It's such a relief," said Aunt Kate to Mrs. Conroy, "that Gabriel is here. I always feel easier in my mind when he's here. Julia, here's Miss Daly and Miss Power. They will take some refreshment. Thanks for your beautiful playing, Miss Daly."
A tall, older man with a stiff grey moustache and darkish skin came out of the front room with his dance partner and said,
"And may we have some refreshment too, Miss Morkan?" "Julia," said Aunt Kate shortly, "and here's Mr. Brown and Miss Furlong. Take them in with Miss Daly and Miss Power."
"I'm the man for the ladies," said Mr. Brown. "And you know, Miss Morkan, the reason they are so fond of me is—"
He did not finish his sentence, but seeing that Aunt Kate was not listening, at once led the 3 young ladies into the back room. There were tables laid for supper here, and in the corner 2 young men were standing drinking. As the ladies said they never took anything strong, Mr. Brown opened 3 bottles of lemonade for them. Then he asked one of the young men to move aside and poured himself a large glass of whisky. The young men eyed him respectfully while he tasted it. Suddenly, a red-faced young woman came into the room, excitedly clapping her hands and crying, "The next dance is about to start!" Close on her heels came Aunt Kate crying, "We need 2 gentlemen and 3 ladies, Mary Jane." Mary Jane, who had entered the room a few minutes before, found partners for Miss Power and Miss Furlong. She turned to Miss Daly. "Oh, Miss Daly, you're awfully good, after playing for the last 2 dances, but really we're so short of ladies tonight." "I don't mind in the least, Miss Morkan." "But I've a nice partner for you, Mr. Bartle Darcy, the tenor. I'll get him to sing later on. All Dublin is wild about him." "Lovely voice, lovely voice," said Aunt Kate. They had hardly left the room
when Aunt Julia wandered slowly in, looking behind her at something.
"What is the matter, Julia?"
asked Aunt Kate anxiously.
"It's only Freddie, Kate, and Gabriel with him,"
said Julia. In fact, right behind her, Gabriel could be seen, bringing Freddie Malins with him. Freddie, a young man of about 40, was of Gabriel's size and build, with very round shoulders. His face was fattish and pale. His half-closed eyes and the untidiness of his thin hair made him look sleepy. He was laughing heartily at a story which he had been telling Gabriel on the stairs, and at the same time rubbing his left eye with his left hand.
"Good evening, Freddie,"
said Aunt Julia. Freddie said good evening to Gabriel's aunts, and then, seeing that Mr. Brown was smiling at him from the drinks table, crossed the room on rather shaky legs. He began to repeat in a low voice the story he had just told to Gabriel.
"He's not so bad, is he?"
said Aunt Kate to Gabriel. Gabriel was frowning, but he answered quickly, "Oh no, hardly noticeable."
"Now isn't he a terrible fellow?" she said. "And his poor mother made him swear never to drink again at New Year. But come on, Gabriel, into the front room."
Before she left the supper room with Gabriel, she signalled to Mr. Brown by frowning and shaking her finger in warning. Mr. Brown nodded in answer and poured out a large glass of lemonade, which he handed to Freddie with a smile. He gave himself a second glass of whisky and went on listening to the younger man's story. Freddie burst out laughing before he had reached the end of his story, and putting down his untasted and overflowing glass, began to rub his left eye again, repeating his last few words as well as his laughter would allow him. Gabriel could not listen while Mary Jane was playing her most difficult piano piece to the silent room. He liked music, but the piece she was playing did not appeal to him, and he doubted whether it did to the other listeners, although they had begged Mary Jane to play something. 4 young men, who had come to stand in the doorway at the sound of the piano, had gone away quietly after a few minutes. The only persons who seemed to follow the music were Mary Jane herself, her hands racing over the keys, and Aunt Kate standing at her elbow to turn the page. He thought of his mother. It was strange that she had had no musical ability, although Aunt Kate used to call her the brains carrier of the Morkan family. Both Kate and Julia had always seemed a little proud of their serious sister. It was she who had chosen the names for her sons, since she had great pride in family life. Thanks to her, Constantine now had a good job in the church, and Gabriel himself had gone to university. A shadow passed over Gabriel's face as he remembered her quiet but firm opposition to his marriage. She had once spoken insultingly of Greta as being just a country girl, and that was not true of Greta at all. It was Greta who had nursed her during her last long illness in their house at Monkstown. He knew that Mary Jane must be near the end of her piece, and while he waited, the anger died down in his heart. Much clapping greeted Mary Jane as, pink-faced with embarrassment, she escaped from the room, rolling up her music nervously. The loudest clapping came from the 4 young men in the doorway, who had gone away at the beginning of the piece, but had come back when the piano stopped. In the next dance, Gabriel found himself partnered with Miss Ivers. She was a talkative, brown-eyed young lady with a direct manner. She did not wear a low-cut dress like most of the other ladies, and her only piece of jewellery, a brooch fixed onto the front of her collar, had an Irish design on it. When the dance had started, she said at once, "I have a crow to pluck with you." "With me?" said Gabriel. He wondered whatever he could have done to annoy her. "What is it?" he asked. She nodded her head firmly. "I have found out that you write for the Daily Express. Now aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Gabriel reddened, but tried to smile. "Why should I be ashamed?" he asked. "Well, I'm ashamed of you," said Miss Ivors, "to write for a dreadful English paper like that. I didn't think you were a West Briton." Gabriel looked puzzled. It was true that he wrote a book review every Wednesday in the Daily Express, but that did not make him a West Briton, surely. The books he received for review were almost more welcome than the few pounds he earned. He loved to feel the covers and turn over the pages of newly printed books. Now he did not know how to defend himself against her accusation. But they had been friends for many years. They had both studied at university and were both teachers, and he could not just brush her off with clever words. So he continued trying to smile and murmured weakly that he saw nothing political in writing reviews of books. When it was time for them to move across to the other dancers, he was still puzzled and thinking of what she had said. Miss Ivors took his hand in her warm one and said, "Of course, I was only joking. Come, we cross over now." When they were together again, she talked about something else, and Gabriel felt more comfortable. Then she said all at once, "Oh, Mr. Conroy, will you come for an excursion to the Aran Isles this summer? We're going to stay there a whole month, out in the Atlantic. It would be wonderful too for Greta if she'd come. She's from the West, from Connacht, isn't she?" "Her people are," said Gabriel shortly. "But you will come, won't you?" said Miss Ivors, laying her warm hand eagerly on his arm. "The fact is," said Gabriel awkwardly, "I have already arranged to go cycling with some fellows. We usually go to France or Belgium, or perhaps Germany." "And why do you go to France and Belgium," said Miss Ivors, "instead of visiting your own land?" "Well," said Gabriel, "it's partly to keep in touch with the languages and partly for a change." "And haven't you your own language to keep in touch with? Irish?" asked Miss Ivors. "Well," said Gabriel, "if it comes to that, you know, Irish is not my language." Their neighbours had turned to listen to the insistent questions and hesitant answers. Gabriel glanced right and left nervously and tried to keep his good humour. "And haven't you your own land to visit?" continued Miss Ivors, "that you know nothing of? Your own people and your own country?" "Oh, to tell you the truth," replied Gabriel suddenly, "I'm sick of my own country. Sick of it." "Why?" asked Miss Ivors. Gabriel did not answer, as his reply had heated him. "Why?" Miss Ivors repeated, and then, when he did not reply, she said warmly, "Of course, you've no answer." Gabriel tried to cover his confusion and annoyance by taking part in the dance with great energy. He avoided her eyes as he had seen a sour expression on her face. But in the next part of the dance he was surprised to feel his hand firmly pressed. She looked at him questioningly for a moment until he smiled. Then, just as they were about to dance on, she stood on tiptoe and whispered into his ear, "West Britain." When the dance was over, Gabriel went away to a far corner of the room, where Freddie Mallins's mother was sitting. He asked the old lady politely how she was, and while she spoke, tried to force out of his mind all memory of the unpleasantness with Miss Ivors. Perhaps he ought not to have answered her like that. But she had no right to call him a West Briton in front of people, even in joke. She had tried to make him look foolish. He saw his wife making her way towards him through the dancing couples. When she reached him, she said into his ear, "Aunt Kate wants to know, won't you carve the goose as usual and I'll do the pudding?" "All right," said Gabriel. "Were you dancing?" "Of course I was. Didn't you see me? What words had you with Molly Ivors?" "No words," said Gabriel moodily. "Only she wanted me to go for a trip to the west of Ireland, and I said I wouldn't." His wife clapped her hands excitedly and gave a little jump. "Oh, do say we'll go, Gabriel. I'd love to see Galway again." "You can go if you like," said Gabriel coldly. She looked at him for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Malins and said, "There's a nice husband for you, Mrs. Malins." Now that supper time was approaching, Gabriel began to worry again about his speech. His warm, trembling fingers touched the cold glass of the window. How cool it must be outside. How pleasant it would be to walk out alone, first along by the river and then through the park. The snow would be lying on the branches of the trees. How much more pleasant it would be there than at the supper table. He ran over the headings of his speech. Irish hospitality, sad memories, the three Mrs. Morkan, the lines from the Browning poem. It made him nervous to think that Miss Ivors would be at the supper table, looking up at him with her critical, questioning eyes while he spoke. Perhaps she would not be sorry to see him fail in his speech. An idea came into his mind and gave him courage. He would say, referring to Aunt Kate and Aunt Julia, "Ladies and gentlemen, older people may have their faults, but in my opinion they have certain qualities of hospitality, of humour, of humanity, which the over-educated younger people who are growing up around us seem to lack." Very good. That was one for Miss Ivors. What did he care that his aunts were only two foolish old women? A murmur in the room attracted his attention. Mr. Brown was advancing from the door, with Aunt Julia leaning on his arm, smiling and hanging her head. There was clapping as she reached the piano, and then, as Mary Jane seated herself to play and Aunt Julia half turned towards the room to sing, it gradually died away. Gabriel recognised the song. It was an old one of Aunt Julia's. Her voice, strong and clear, attacked with great spirit the difficult runs of notes, and she sang very rapidly and accurately. To follow the voice, without looking at the singer's face, was to feel and share the excitement of fast and confident flight. Gabriel clapped loudly with all the others at the close of the song. Freddie was still clapping when everyone else had stopped. At last, when he could clap no more, he stood up suddenly and hurried across the room to Aunt Julia, taking and holding her hand in both of his. "I was just telling my mother," he said. "I never heard you sing so well. Never. No, I never heard your voice so good as it is tonight. Would you believe that now? That's the honest truth." Aunt Julia smiled and murmured something as she released her hand from his. Mr. Brown put out his open hand towards her and said, "Miss Julia Morkan, my latest discovery." He was laughing very heartily at this when Freddie turned to him and said, "Well, Brown, you might make a worse discovery. All I can say is I never heard her sing half so well as long as I've been coming here." "Neither did I," said Mr. Brown. "I think her voice has greatly improved." Aunt Julia said modestly, but with a touch of pride, 30 years ago I hadn't a bad voice, as voices go." "I often told Julia," said Aunt Kate firmly, "that she was simply thrown away in that choir, but she never would listen to me. Wearing herself out in that choir night and day. And all for what? Mary Jane, seeing that her aunt was becoming angry and knowing that this was a matter she felt strongly about, said quickly, "You know, Aunt Kate, we really are all very hungry, so we had better go to supper and finish our discussion afterwards." On his way to the supper room, Gabriel found his wife and Mary Jane trying to persuade Miss Ivors to stay for supper. But Miss Ivors would not stay. She did not feel in the least hungry, and she had already overstayed her time. "But how can you get home?" asked Mrs. Conroy. "Oh, it's only 2 steps up the road." Gabriel hesitated a moment and said, "If you will allow me, Miss Ivors, I'll see you home if you really are obliged to go." But Miss Ivors broke away from them. "I won't hear of it," she cried, adding with a laugh, "Bannock live! Goodbye to all!" as she ran down the stairs. Gabriel asked himself if he was the cause of her sudden departure, but she did not seem to be cross. She had gone away laughing. He stared vacantly after her. At that moment, Aunt Kate came out of the supper room, almost crying in despair. "Where on earth is Gabriel?" she cried. "There's everyone waiting in there, and nobody to carve the goose." "Here I am, Aunt Kate," cried Gabriel, suddenly cheerful again, ready to carve any number of geese if necessary. They went into the supper room. A fat brown goose lay at one end of the table, and at the other end, on a bed of paper, lay a great ham. Beside this was a round of beef. Between these rival ends ran lines of side dishes: 2 little towers of fruit jelly, red and yellow, a shallow dish full of blocks of milk pudding, a large green leaf-shaped dish on which lay bunches of purple grapes and nuts, a companion dish on which lay a solid rectangle of dried figs, and a small bowl full of chocolates and sweets wrapped in gold and silver paper. In the centre of the table there stood, as guards to a fruit stand which held a pyramid of oranges and American apples, 2 old-fashioned cut-glass decanters containing sherry. On the closed square piano, a pudding in a huge yellow dish lay in waiting, and behind it were bottles of dark beer, light beer, and soft drinks. Gabriel took his seat confidently at the head of the table and pushed the carving fork firmly into the goose. He felt quite relaxed now, as he was an expert carver and liked nothing better than to find himself at the head of a well-laden table. "Miss Furlong, what shall I send you?" he asked. "A wing or a slice of the white meat?"
"Just a small slice of the white meat."
"Miss Higgins, what for you?"
"Oh, anything at all, Mr. Conroy."
While Gabriel and Miss Daly exchanged plates of goose and plates of ham and beef, Lily went from guest to guest with a dish of hot potatoes wrapped in a white cloth. Mary Jane served her pupils and made sure that they got the best slices of meat, and Aunt Kate and Aunt Julia opened bottles of beer for the gentlemen and soft drinks for the ladies. There was a great deal of confusion and laughter and noise, the noise of orders and counter-orders, of knives and forks, of plates and glasses. When everyone had been well served, Gabriel said, smiling, "Now, if anyone wants a little more, let him or her speak." People all spoke at once, inviting him to begin his own supper. "Very well," said Gabriel pleasantly. "Kindly forget my existence, ladies and gentlemen, for a few minutes." During supper, the conversation turned to the opera company, which was then performing at the Theatre Royal. Mr. Bartle Darcy, the tenor, praised the company's leading contralto very highly, but Miss Furlong thought she had a rather low-class style. Mr. Brown spoke of the old Italian companies that used to come to Dublin, and named the singers: Tietjens, Trebelli, Ilma de Murzka, Campagnini, the great Giulini, Revelli Aramburo.
"Those were the days," he said, "when there was something like singing to be heard in Dublin."
"Oh, well," said Mr. Darcy, "I suppose there are as good singers today as there were then. I imagine that Caruso, for example, is quite as good as any of those you have mentioned." "Oh, I'd give anything to hear Caruso sing," said Mary Jane. "For me," said Aunt Kate, "there was only one tenor. To please me, I mean. But I suppose none of you ever heard of him." "Who was he, Miss Morkan?" asked Mr. Darcy politely. "His name was Parkinson. I heard him when he was at his best, and I think he had then the purest tenor voice that was ever put into a man's throat." "Strange," said Mr. Bartle Darcy. "I never even heard of him." The meat plates were removed, and they moved on to the huge sweet pudding made by Aunt Julia herself. Soon the fruit and chocolates and sweets were passed round the table, and guests had their glasses filled with sherry. Gradually all the conversation came to an end, and Gabriel stood up. He leaned his trembling fingers on the tablecloth and smiled nervously at the upturned faces around him. He began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is not the first time that we have gathered together under this hospitable roof, around this hospitable table. It is not the first time that we have been, I might say, the victims of the hospitality of certain good ladies." He made a circle in the air with his arm and paused. Everyone smiled at Aunt Kate and Aunt Julia and Mary Jane, who all turned red with pleasure. Encouraged, Gabriel went on. "I feel more strongly with every passing year that our country has no tradition which it should guard so jealously as that of its hospitality. Of one thing at least I am sure. As long as this roof shelters the good ladies I have mentioned, and I wish from my heart it may do so for many and many a long year to come, the tradition of real, warm-hearted Irish hospitality is still alive. Ladies and gentlemen, the young people growing up among us have new ideas and new beliefs. Their enthusiasm for these new ideas, even when it is misdirected, is, I believe, sincere. But sometimes I fear that these young people, educated or over-educated as they are, will lose those qualities of humanity, of hospitality, of kindly humour, which belonged to an older day. Let us hope, then, at least, that in gatherings such as this we shall still remember people from the past with pride and affection, still hold in our hearts the memory of those dead and gone great ones, whose fame the world will not willingly let die. But our path through life is crowded with many such sad memories, and if we thought only of them, we could not find the heart to go on bravely with our work among the living. Therefore I will speak no more of the past. I will not let any sadness invade our party tonight. We meet here as friends, as colleagues, and as guests of... what shall I call them? 3 stars of the Dublin musical world. The table burst into clapping and laughter. Gabriel glanced down at his aunts, and seeing the large smile on Aunt Julia's face and the tears in Aunt Kate's eyes, brought his speech rapidly to its close. He raised his glass of wine. Let us drink to all 3 of them. Let us drink to their health, wealth, long life, happiness, and good fortune, and may they long continue in the proud and well-deserved position which they hold in their profession, and the position of respect and affection which they hold in our hearts. All the guests stood up, glass in hand, and turning towards the 3 seated ladies, sang together, Mr. Brown conducting. For they are jolly good fellows, for they are jolly good fellows, for they are jolly good fellows, which nobody can deny. The cheering and clapping which followed was taken up beyond the door of the supper-room by many of the other guests, Freddie Malins encouraging everyone with his fork held high. The bitter morning air came into the hall where they were standing, so that Aunt Kate said, "Close the door, somebody." "Brown is out there, Aunt Kate," said Mary Jane.
Brown is everywhere,
said Aunt Kate, lowering her voice.
He's been a fixture here, like the gas, all during Christmas.
She laughed good-humouredly. Mr. Brown came in, laughing as if his heart would break, and saying,
"Freddie will have all the carriages in Dublin out."
Gabriel put his coat on, and looking round the hall, said, "Greta not down yet?"
"She's getting on her things upstairs,"
said Aunt Kate. There was a loud knock at the door. Mary Jane rushed to open it and let in Freddie Malins. He and Mr. Brown helped Mrs. Malins down the front steps and into the carriage which Freddie had found. There was a good deal of confused talk and directions to the driver, but eventually Freddie and Mr. Brown got into the carriage after Mrs. Malins, and it started off, followed by laughter and goodbyes from the Misses Morkan and their guests. Gabriel had not gone to the door with the others. He was in a dark part of the hall looking up the stairs. A woman was standing near the top of the stairs, in the shadow. He could not see her face, but he could see the lower part of her dress. It was his wife. She was listening to something. Gabriel was surprised at her stillness and tried hard to listen too. But he could only hear the noise of laughter on the front steps, a few notes on the piano upstairs, and a few notes of a man's voice singing. He stood still, trying to catch the song that the voice was singing and looking up at his wife. There was beauty and mystery in her attitude, as if she represented something. He asked himself what a woman standing on the stairs in the shadow, listening to distant music, might represent. If he were a painter, he would paint her in that attitude, and call his picture Distant Music. The hall door was closed, and Aunt Kate, Aunt Julia, and Mary Jane came down the hall, still laughing. Gabriel held up his hand for them to be silent. The song seemed to be an old Irish tune, and the words expressed great sadness. "Oh, the rain falls on my heavy locks, and the dew wets my skin. My babe lies cold." "Oh!" exclaimed Mary Jane. "It's Bartle D'Arcy singing, and he wouldn't sing all the night." Suddenly the singing stopped, and the piano lid was closed. Gabriel saw his wife come downstairs towards them. A few steps behind her were Mr. Bartle D'Arcy and Miss O'Callaghan. "Oh, Mr. D'Arcy," cried Mary Jane, "it's mean of you to break off like that, when we were all listening with such delight." "Can't you hear I have a sore throat?" said Mr. D'Arcy roughly, and he went off to put on his overcoat. The others, surprised by his rudeness, were silent. "It's the weather," said Aunt Julia after a pause. "Yes, everybody has colds," said Aunt Kate quickly. "They say," said Mary Jane, "we haven't had snow like it for 30 years. And I read this morning in the newspaper that the snow is general all over Ireland." "I love the look of snow," said Aunt Julia sadly. Mr. D'Arcy returned, fully wrapped and buttoned, and made his apology by telling them the history of his cold. Everyone gave him advice and urged him to be very careful of his throat in the night air. Gabriel watched his wife, who did not join in the conversation. The flame of the gaslight in the hall lit up the rich, deep brown of her hair, which he had seen her drying at the fire a few days before. She seemed unaware of the talk around her. At last, she turned towards them and asked Mr. Darcy for the name of the song. He replied that it was called The Lass of Aughrim. Gabriel saw that there was colour in her face, and her eyes were shining. A sudden wave of joy flowed wildly out of his heart. They all said their goodbyes in the hall and left the house. The morning was still dark. A dull yellow light hung over the houses and the river, and the sky seemed to be descending. Gabriel was walking with Miss O'Callaghan, and his wife was walking in front with Mr. Bartle Darcy, her shoes in a brown parcel under her arm. She was walking so lightly that he desperately wanted to run after her noiselessly, catch her by the shoulders, and say something foolish and loving into her ear. Moments of their secret life together burst like stars onto his memory. A wave of yet more deeply felt joy escaped from his heart and rushed through his body. He wanted to remind her of those moments, to make her forget the years of their dull existence together and remember only their moments of glorious happiness. Despite their children, his writing, her household cares, he felt that all their souls' passionate fire was still burning. In one letter that he had written to her then, he had said, "Why is it that words like these seem to me so dull and cold? Is it because there is no word full enough of love to be your name?" Like distant music, these words he had written years before came towards him from the past. All he wanted was to be alone with her. When he and she were in their room in the hotel, he would call her softly. Perhaps she would be undressing and not hear him at first. Then she would turn and look at him. When they reached the hotel, they said goodbye to Mr. Bartle Darcy and Miss O'Callaghan and went in. Greta leaned for a moment on Gabriel's arm, and, after the return of so many memories, the first touch of her body, musical and strange and perfumed, sent through him a sharp feeling of desire. Under cover of her silence, he pressed her arm closely to his side, and as they stood at the hotel door, he felt they had escaped from their lives and duties, escaped from home and friends, and run away together with wild and passionate hearts to a new adventure. An old man was half asleep in an armchair in the hall. He lit a candle and went in front of them to the stairs. They followed in silence, their feet falling softly on the thickly carpeted stairs. She climbed the stairs behind the old man, her head bowed, her delicate shoulders curved as though carrying a load, her skirt gathered tightly round her. He could have thrown his arms around her and held her still, because his arms were trembling with desire to seize her, and only the press of his fingernails on the insides of his hands kept the wildness of his body under control. When they entered the room, the old man began to apologize about the electric light, but Gabriel cut him short. "Oh, we don't want any light. We have light enough from the street," he said. "And please, take your candle away with you like a good man." The man looked surprised, but went slowly away, and Gabriel locked the door. A ghostly light from the street lamp lay in a long line from one window to the door. Gabriel threw his coat and hat on a chair and crossed the room towards the window. He looked down into the street in order to calm his emotions a little. Then he turned, with his back to the light, and looked at her. She was standing in front of a large mirror, beginning to undo her dress. "Greta," he said. She turned away from the mirror slowly and walked along the line of light towards him. Her face looked so serious that the words would not pass his lips. No, it was not the moment yet. "You look tired," he said.
"I am, a little,"
she answered. She went on to the window and stood there looking out. "By the way, Greta," Gabriel added, fearing that he was losing confidence. "You know poor Freddie Malins? Well, he gave me back that money I lent him after all. It's a pity he doesn't keep away from Brown, because he's not a bad fellow at heart." He was trembling now with annoyance. What was she thinking about? If she would only turn to him and make the first move. He was in such a fever of anger and desire that he did not hear her come from the window. She stood in front of him for an instant, looking at him strangely. Then suddenly, raising herself on tiptoe, she kissed him.
"You are a very generous person, Gabriel,"
she said. Gabriel, trembling with delight at her sudden kiss, put his hands on her hair and began smoothing it back. His heart was full of happiness. Perhaps her thoughts had been running with his, and she understood and accepted his desire. Slipping one arm round her body and pulling her towards him, he said softly, "Greta, dear, what are you thinking about? I think I know what it is." "Do I know?" She did not answer at once. Then she said, bursting into tears, "Oh, I am thinking about that song, 'The Lass of Aughrim.'" She broke loose from him and threw herself onto the bed, hiding her face. Gabriel stood still for a moment in great surprise. "What about the song? Why does that make you cry?" She dried her eyes with the back of her hand like a child, and said, "I am thinking about a person long ago who used to sing that song." "And who was the person long ago?" asked Gabriel, smiling.
"I used to know him in Galway when I was living with my grandmother," she said.
The smile passed away from Gabriel's face. A dull anger began to gather again at the back of his mind, and the dull fires of his desire began to heat his blood. "Someone you were in love with?" he asked.
"It was a young boy I used to know, named Michael Fury. He used to sing that song. I can see him so plainly. Such eyes as he had. Big, dark eyes. And such an expression in them."
"Oh, then you were in love with him," said Gabriel.
"I used to go out walking with him," she said, "when I was in Galway. I was close to him at the time."
"Perhaps that was why you wanted to go to Galway with that Ivors girl," he said coldly.
"What for?"
she asked in surprise. "How do I know? To see him, perhaps." She looked away from him along the line of light towards the window in silence.
"He is dead,"
she said eventually.
"He died when he was only 17. Isn't it a terrible thing to die so young as that?"
Gabriel felt bitter. While he had been full of memories of their secret life together, full of joy and desire, She had been comparing him in her mind with another. He became shamefully aware of his own person, seeing himself as a laughable, unattractive figure. He turned his back more to the light to prevent her seeing the shame that burned on his forehead. And what did he die of so young, Greta?
I think he died for me.
A nameless terror took hold of Gabriel, as if some hateful force was attacking him just at the moment when he had expected victory. But he shook himself free of it, and taking her hand, began to stroke it kindly.
It was in the winter, she said, when I was going to leave my grandmother's and come to Dublin. And he was ill at the time, because his health was delicate. Poor fellow. He was very fond of me, and he was such a gentle boy. He was going to study singing. He had a very good voice, poor Michael Fury. And so I wrote him a letter saying I was going up to Dublin, and would be back in the summer, and was hoping he would be better then.
She paused for a moment to get her voice under control, and then went on.
Then, the night before I left, I was in my grandmother's house, packing up, and I heard stones thrown up against the window. So I ran downstairs into the garden, and there was the poor fellow trembling with cold. I begged him to go home at once, and told him he would get his death in the rain. But he said he did not want to live. I can see his eyes now. He was standing at the end of the wall, where there was a tree.
And did he go home? Asked Gabriel.
Yes, he went home. And when I was only a week in Dublin, he died, and he was buried in Oughterard, the village his people came from. Oh, the day I heard that he was dead.
She stopped, overcome by emotion, and threw herself face downwards on the bed. Gabriel held her hand for a moment longer, then, shy of interrupting her misery, let it fall gently and walked quietly to the window. She was fast asleep. Gabriel, lying on his elbow, looked for a few moments at her untidy hair and half-open mouth, listening to her deep-drawn breath. So she had had that adventure in her life. A man had died for her sake. It hardly pained him now to think how poor a part he, her husband, had played in her life. He watched her while she slept, as though he and she had never lived together as man and wife. His curious eyes rested long on her face and on her hair, and as he thought of what she must have been then, in that time of her first girlish beauty, a strange, friendly pity for her entered his soul. He did not like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew that it was no longer the face for which Michael Fury had braved death. Perhaps she had not told him all the story. His eyes moved to the chair over which she had thrown some of her clothes. A petticoat string hung down to the floor. One boot stood upright, the other lay on its side. He wondered at the wildness of his emotions of an hour before. From what had it come? From his aunt's supper, from his own foolish speech, from the wine and dancing, the cheerful good nights in the hall, the pleasure of the walk along the river in the snow.
Poor Aunt Julia. She, too, would soon be a shade with the shade of his dead mother, Ellen. He had caught that deathly look on her face for a moment when she was singing her song. Soon, perhaps, he would be back in that same front room, dressed in black, his silk hat on his knees, finding only clumsy, useless words to comfort Aunt Kate as she told him sadly how Julia had died. Yes, that would happen very soon. The air of the room felt cold on his shoulders. He stretched himself cautiously along under the sheets and lay down beside his wife. One by one they were all becoming shades. Better pass with head held high into that other world, in the full glory of some passion, than fade and dry up miserably with age. He thought of how she who lay beside him had locked in her heart for so many years that memory of her lover's eyes when he had told her that he did not wish to live. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the shape of a young man standing under a tree in the rain. Other shapes were near. His soul had approached that region which the numberless dead inhabit. He was conscious of their shadowy existence. His own identity was fading out into a grey, unreal world. The solid world, which these dead had once lived in, was dissolving around him. A few light taps on the glass made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. Sleepily he watched the snow fall, silver and dark against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central lowlands, on the treeless hills, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, rebellious waves of the River Shannon. It was falling, too, on every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the whole world, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, on all the living and the dead.